Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we step into the silent corridors of power, into the world of a man who didn't need a shout to be feared. Paul Vario. To most, he was the quiet businessman from Brooklyn. To the FBI, he was one of the most powerful capos the Lucchese family ever had. And to those inside his crew, he was the forgotten Goodfellas Godfather, the man who made the world of Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke possible. Before we begin, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? We love seeing our underworld stretch across countries and time zones. Now, take a breath, let the noise fade away, and step with us into the shadows, where loyalty was currency, silence was power, and betrayal had only one punishment. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story from the dark side of history. Because every week, we dig deeper into the men who built empires in the shadows and paid the price for it. Chapter 1. Roots in Brooklyn, 1914, 1930s. Brooklyn, summer of 1931. The air smelled of hot tar and cheap cigars, and the sidewalks hummed with the kind of tension only poverty can breed. A young man leaned against a lamppost on East 96th Street, his sleeves rolled up, eyes half hidden beneath the brim of a fedora. His name was Paul Vario, though most people on the block just called him Paulie. At 17, he already carried himself like someone twice his age, not because of wisdom, but because of survival. He learned early that in Brooklyn, if you didn't make the rules, you were crushed by them. That day, he was about to make his first real mistake, the kind that would set his path for life. But to understand that moment, you have to go back to where it all began. Paul was born in New York City on July 10th, 1914, to Italian immigrants who came with nothing but calloused hands and old country dreams. His father, a bricklayer, believed in honest work, but honest work didn't pay the rent on Knickerbocker Avenue. The Great War had ended, but the streets were still filled with the hungry, men begging for a break that would never come. The Vario family lived in a cramped tenement where the wallpaper peeled and the noise never stopped. Paul shared a bed with his brothers, and even as a child, he watched his mother's eyes tighten when the landlord came knocking. That look stayed with him, the quiet fear of a woman who'd done everything right but still had nothing to show for it. By the time he was 10, Paul understood two truths about Brooklyn. First, nobody gave you anything. Second, the men who had money didn't talk about where it came from. They wore good suits, carried themselves with calm confidence, and always had someone ready to open the door for them. Paul didn't just admire them, he studied them. The way they moved through the neighborhood, how the butcher would weigh their meat a little lighter, how the cops nodded respectfully when they passed. In a world that looked down on immigrants, these men were untouchable. They weren't just gangsters. They were proof that power could be earned outside the system. When Prohibition hit, Brooklyn became an ecosystem of shadows. The sound of jazz bled from basement speakeasies, and trucks moved through the night like ghosts carrying liquid gold. To a kid like Paul, it wasn't crime, it was opportunity. He started as a runner, delivering small packages for a corner bar that didn't officially exist. He didn't ask what was inside. Sometimes it was envelopes, sometimes bottles. But every delivery came with a little cash and a nod of approval. That nod meant more than the money. It meant he was seen. He was a smart kid, sharper than his rough edges suggested. Teachers noticed it, but so did the wrong kind of men. By 16, Paul was skipping school and running errands for neighborhood crews, cleaning cars, collecting bets, standing watch while others did the real work. Every job was a lesson. He learned which cops could be paid, which couldn't, and how to read a man's temper before it exploded. The streets became his classroom, and respect was the diploma he was chasing. Brooklyn in the 1920s wasn't just tough. It was alive with a kind of restless energy that made or broke people. Every block had its own rules, its own bosses, and its own unspoken lines of control. The Irish ran the docks, the Italians ran the markets, and the Jews handled the money. It wasn't about color or faith. It was about survival through power. If you crossed the line, You didn't get a warning. You disappeared. Paul grew up in that balance. A world where silence was safer than courage, and where the difference between loyalty and death was just a name whispered in the wrong ear. He started earning his reputation the old-fashioned way, with fists. One night outside a Brooklyn pool hall, he got into a fight that would become local legend. A neighborhood tough, twice his size, shoved him for looking too long. Paul didn't back down. He broke the man's nose and two of his ribs before anyone could pull him off. It wasn't about violence. It was about sending a message. He wasn't just another kid from the block. He was someone you didn't forget. The next day, the local bookmaker slipped him $10 for security work. That was more money than his father made in a week. In that moment, Paul stopped dreaming of an honest life. But every rise begins with a stumble. And for Paul, the stumble came soon. His first arrest was almost comical, stealing a truckload of empty beer barrels to sell for scrap. The cops caught him before he got off the block. He spent the night in a holding cell that smelled like sweat and cheap whiskey. Most kids would have been scared straight. Paul wasn't. He sat there quietly, memorizing everything. How the cops talked, who they respected, who they didn't. When he was released, he walked out with a smirk, already calculating how to do it better next time. That was the difference between Paul and most men. He didn't fear consequence. He studied it. By 18, he was dabbling in everything. Petty theft, running numbers, a little bootlegging when he could. He learned that crime, like any business, had structure. At the bottom were the kids like him, doing grunt work. Above them were the soldiers, men who carried guns and fear in equal measure. And above them were the ones who never got their hands dirty, but controlled everything with a quiet word or a raised eyebrow. Paul wanted to be one of them. He didn't care about glory. He cared about control. The end of Prohibition in 1933 didn't slow him down. While others scrambled to find new rackets, Paul saw the opening. The streets were full of unemployed enforcers, drivers, and bootleggers, all looking for direction. He stepped in quietly, organizing small operations around Canari and Brownsville. Nothing major, just enough to keep money moving. He ran poker games, took a cut from bar owners, and kept order among the small-time crooks. He wasn't a boss yet, but the neighborhood treated him like one. Even the cops started using his name with caution. Still, Brooklyn was a dangerous place to stand out. Every crew had rivals, and ambition was a loaded gun. Paul knew that survival depended on two things: loyalty and invisibility. He learned to talk less, to listen more, to make moves without leaving fingerprints. The men who lasted longest weren't the loudest or the most violent. They were the ones who blended into the crowd. It was during these years that Paul earned his first nickname, the Quiet One. It wasn't meant as praise, but it fit him perfectly. He realized that silence was its own kind of weapon, one that disarmed even the most suspicious enemy. One night in the late 1930s, Paul found himself sitting in a smoky backroom of a social club on Liberty Avenue. Across from him sat a man named Tommy Lucchese, sharp, calm, and already a rising power in the Italian underworld. The meeting wasn't planned. It was an introduction made through mutual respect. Tommy saw something in Paul, a steadiness that most men in this life didn't have. They talked for less than 20 minutes, but that conversation changed everything. When Paul walked out of that room, he wasn't just another street hustler. He was on the radar of one of New York's most powerful families. But even as his influence grew, the weight of it began to show. His father barely spoke to him anymore. His mother prayed louder each Sunday, hoping her son would walk away before it was too late. Paul never argued with her. He'd sit at the kitchen table, nodding, promising he'd be careful. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The life had already chosen him. What started as a means to survive had become his identity, the only thing that gave him purpose. He wasn't chasing wealth anymore. He was chasing permanence. Respect, the kind that couldn't be taken away. By 25, his name carried quiet power in Brooklyn. People who crossed him disappeared from the streets. Those who stayed loyal never went hungry. The police had his name in their files, but nobody could make charges stick. Every arrest ended the same way. Missing witnesses, changed statements, and a calm smile from Paul as he walked free. The system couldn't pin him down because he understood it too well. He knew which judges played golf with which politicians, and which detectives had debts they couldn't pay. Power, he realized, wasn't about bullets. It was about knowing who owed what to whom. The Depression had crushed most working-class dreams, but for Paul, it was fuel. He built networks in the shadows while the rest of the city lined up for bread. To him, every struggling man was a potential recruit, every desperate business a new opportunity. The city's chaos became his camouflage, and through it all, he stayed quiet, the ghost in the system, invisible to most, yet pulling strings that reached farther than anyone imagined. But power is never without cost. One cold night in 1939, Paul sat in the back of a car on Atlantic Avenue, watching two men argue in the street. One of them was a friend, a man he'd grown up with. The other was a rival bookie who'd refused to pay tribute. Paul didn't give the order, but he didn't stop what came next either. The flash of the gun was quick, the silence afterward even quicker. As the car drove off, Paul stared out the window, his reflection merging with the city lights. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he'd built. It wasn't guilt, it was realization. He was part of something larger now, something that could never be undone. In the years that followed, Brooklyn changed, but Paul didn't. He adapted, adjusted, and kept climbing. He learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to make people forget his face but remember his name. The crews beneath him grew, feeding into a network that reached all the way into the airports, the docks, and the unions. Every handshake was a silent deal, every favor a thread in his expanding web. By the time the Second World War began, Paul Vario was no longer just a street kid from Brooklyn. He was a quiet architect of organized power, the kind that could shift the balance of an entire borough. Yet even then, as he stood at the edge of true power, a small part of him still remembered that tenement kitchen, his mother's trembling hands, his father's disappointment, the smell of brick dust and fear. Maybe that's why he never smiled much. Success, for Paul, didn't feel like victory. It felt like inevitability, like a storm that had been gathering since the day he was born. And so, the boy who once delivered packages for pennies was now a man shaping the underworld with invisible hands. But in the shadows of Brooklyn's new empire, danger was already stirring, because the more quiet power you hold, the louder your enemies begin to whisper. The next chapter of Paul Vario's life will begin with a knock on a door that should never have opened. Chapter 2. The 1937 Case and Hard Time. The cell door slammed with a hollow clang that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Cold metal, colder air, and the smell of bleach and sweat filled the narrow corridor. Somewhere a man was laughing, that hard, empty kind of laughter that doesn't come from joy, but from the acceptance of pain. Paul sat on the edge of a thin mattress, staring at the floor, his hands folded like he was saying a prayer he didn't believe in. 1937. The year Brooklyn learned that even the quiet ones could fall. And the year Paul Vario's name was written into the records of Sing Sing prison. It wasn't the first time he'd been arrested, but it was the first time he truly understood what the word consequence meant. Just a few years earlier, he'd been building something. A network, small but solid, rooted in the back rooms and pool halls of Canari. He'd learned how to move contraband without attention, how to turn favors into protection, how to make himself valuable to men who mattered. But when power comes fast, so does arrogance. And Paul, young, sharp, and already feared, began to believe he was untouchable. That illusion shattered one humid night when everything went wrong. The story, as the papers told it, was simple. Assault. A man beaten within an inch of his life outside a Brooklyn bar. But the truth ran deeper. It wasn't a random act. It was a message. The victim had refused to pay a cut from his numbers operation, thinking he could handle business without permission. Paul had warned him once. The second time, he didn't talk. He acted. The beating was quick, brutal, and efficient, a show of dominance, not rage. But someone talked. Someone always does. When the police came for him, Paul didn't run. Running was for cowards, and cowards never lasted in this world. He stood in his doorway, hands steady, cigarette burning down to his fingers as they cuffed him. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains, silent. No one dared meet his eyes. That was respect, the kind built on fear. But even respect couldn't change what was coming. The trial moved fast. Brooklyn's courts were tired of the mob's invisible rule, and Paul was made an example. The judge called him a menace, a threat to decent society. Paul just stared back, expressionless. When the gavel dropped and the sentence was read, 10 to 20 years, he didn't flinch. Inside, though, something shifted. The streets had always been his kingdom. Now, the kingdom was gone, and all that remained were walls, bars, and silence. Sing Sing wasn't built to rehabilitate men like Paul. It was built to break them. The prison sat on the banks of the Hudson River, gray and merciless, with guards who knew that cruelty kept order better than rules. The first night, Paul lay awake listening to the hum of electricity from the chair in the next building. They called it Old Sparky. Every inmate knew what that hum meant. Someone's story had ended. It was a reminder that in here, nobody was untouchable. At first, Paul tried to keep his head down. He followed the routine, did his work, spoke little. But quiet in prison was mistaken for weakness, and weakness was blood in the water. One morning in the yard, a man tested him, a lifer from the Bronx who thought he could make a name off the new guy. Paul didn't hesitate. He struck first, fast, a broken nose and a jaw at a place before the guards even noticed. It wasn't about rage. It was about survival. From that day on, no one tried him again. The inmates called him Brooklyn, and they learned to give him space. Over time, prison became a strange kind of school. Paul watched, listened, adapted. He learned about connections that stretched far beyond New York, bootleg networks, loan shark chains, stolen goods moving across state lines. Men who'd once been his enemies became teachers. Some even respected his discipline. Unlike most, Paul didn't brag or complain. He absorbed everything like a sponge, storing it for later. The system thought it was locking him away. In truth, it was refining him. Letters came rarely. His mother wrote every few months, telling him about the weather, about family dinners, about how she still lit a candle for him every Sunday. His father never wrote. The silence between them had become permanent. Paul didn't mind. In his mind, this was just a chapter, a long, brutal one, but temporary. He would outlast the walls. That was the promise he made to himself every night before sleep. The years inside changed him. The cocky edge dulled into patience. The temper cooled into calculation. He started thinking in decades instead of days. He realized that real power wasn't in fists or guns. It was in patience, leverage, and memory. When you know who owes who, and when to call on a favor, you never have to raise your voice. It was a lesson that would define his rise later, the art of control through calm. Still, prison time was never clean. Paul saw men broken beyond repair. He saw others killed for cigarettes, stabbed over cards, beaten for looking the wrong way. Once, he spent a month in solitary for punching a guard who'd pushed too far. In that tiny concrete box, time became elastic. Days stretched, thoughts twisted. He replayed his choices, not with regret, but with clarity. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry for being caught. That distinction mattered. It meant he would never make the same mistake again. When he finally got parole after nearly 8 years, he walked out of Sing Sing leaner, harder, quieter. Brooklyn had changed while he was gone. The skyline had grown. The cars were sleeker, the music louder. But some things stayed the same. The backroom deals, the coded glances, the power simmering beneath everyday life. Paul stepped back into that world like a man re-entering a house he'd built himself. Nothing felt foreign. He went back to the old neighborhoods, but he didn't announce his return. He moved carefully, reconnecting with old friends, testing who was still loyal. Many of his old associates had vanished, swallowed by prison or the grave. But a few had risen, and they remembered him. To them, Paul wasn't just another ex-con. He was a survivor, a man who'd done real time and come out stronger. In the underworld, that was currency. One of those who still remembered was Tommy Lucchese. By now, Tommy had climbed high in the Lucchese family hierarchy. He was smart, understated, and respected by all 5 families. Tommy didn't forget people who kept their word, and Paul had never broken his. Within months, Paul found himself under Lucchese's wing. Not officially yet, but close enough to feel the power radiating from proximity. He started small again, overseeing gambling spots, collecting debts, smoothing over disputes. But this time, he worked with precision. Every decision was measured, every move designed to build long-term stability. For all his new discipline, the years hadn't softened him. When he needed to enforce, he did it with cold efficiency. Violence wasn't a thrill. It was punctuation, the period at the end of a sentence that needed saying. People who crossed him rarely made the same mistake twice. Word spread quietly through Brooklyn's bars and union halls. Paul Vario was back, and this time, he wasn't just another tough guy. He was something else entirely. Controlled, strategic, dangerous in silence. In the evenings, he'd sit in a booth at Gefkin's bar, the future hub of his empire, nursing a drink and saying little. Men came and went, handing him envelopes, asking for advice, seeking permission. He rarely gave direct orders. Instead, he'd listen, nod, and let silence do the talking. People filled silence with obedience. It was a psychological trick he'd learned behind bars, the power of stillness. Yet even as he rebuilt his position, part of him remained haunted by those prison years. Not by fear, but by what he'd lost. Time mostly. Youth. He was in his 40s now, though he still moved with the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to prove anything. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk alone through the streets of Canari, looking at the row houses, the flicker of TVs and windows, the children laughing on stoops. He'd wonder, briefly, if another life had ever been possible. But then a car would slow near the curb, someone would lower a window, and an envelope would exchange hands. The thought would vanish. This was his life. This was what he'd earned. Inside the Lucchese structure, Paul's rise was methodical. He didn't seek attention. He let others chase headlines, get careless, attract heat. The bosses appreciated his steadiness. They called him reliable, the kind of man who could be trusted with anything. It was rare praise in a world built on betrayal. He began overseeing multiple crews, handling loan sharking, extortion, and control of trucking operations. His network touched JFK Airport long before the name meant money to the mob. Paul had learned something invaluable in prison. Crime, like business, was about logistics. If you controlled movement, you controlled profit. His father died during those years. Paul didn't go to the funeral. Some said it was cold, others said it was guilt. Maybe it was both. But he sent money for the burial, and that was enough. For Paul, emotion was a weakness he couldn't afford. In his mind, love was loyalty, and loyalty was shown through action, not tears. Brooklyn was changing again. The war had ended, soldiers were coming home, and America was entering a golden age built on credit, cars, and consumption. To most, it looked like prosperity. To Paul, it looked like opportunity. More money in pockets meant more gambling, more debts, more leverage. He diversified, betting parlors, vending routes, and soon, deeper connections with the unions. The quiet boy who once delivered beer bottles was now pulling strings that reached into legitimate industries. The lines between lawful and unlawful blurred until they were meaningless. Still, memories of Sing Sing followed him like a shadow. He hired ex-cons, not out of charity, but because he understood them. Men who had been caged learned obedience and caution, traits that made them useful. They owed him, and he never forgot who owed him what. He built loyalty the way a mason builds a wall, one brick at a time, tight, deliberate, unbreakable. There were moments, though, when cracks showed. Nights when he'd drink alone, eyes fixed on nothing, cigarette smoke curling like ghosts in the dim light. Once, an old friend from the neighborhood asked him if prison had scared him straight. Paul just laughed, a low, quiet laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "It didn't scare me," he said softly. "It showed me who I am." Those words summed up everything about him. Prison hadn't destroyed him. It had clarified him. It stripped away illusion and left only ambition. From then on, Paul Vario lived with one goal: to build something that would outlast him, to create a system so woven into the city's veins that even the law couldn't pull it out. And as the 1950s approached, he was getting closer to that dream than ever. But power, no matter how quiet, always attracts noise. The men around him were growing restless. Younger, hungrier, less disciplined. They saw the money flowing and wanted more of it. Paul watched them carefully: Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, Tommy D. Simone, names that would one day become infamous. At that time, they were just earners in his orbit, ambitious and reckless. He saw potential in them, but he also saw danger. The city was changing too. Law enforcement was evolving, learning to think like the criminals they hunted. Wiretaps, informants, undercover agents. The walls were closing in on the world Paul had spent decades mastering. But he didn't panic. He'd been behind walls before. He knew how to wait, how to adapt, how to survive. In the end, Sing Sing had given him more than it took. It taught him that control wasn't about fear. It was about patience, precision, and silence. The kind of silence that could stretch for years, until the perfect moment arrived. And that moment was coming. Because soon, the quiet man for Brooklyn would find himself at the center of something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. A crew that would change the face of American organized crime forever. And somewhere deep down, in that still part of his mind that never slept, Paul knew it was only a matter of time before the walls came closing in again. Only this time, when they did, he wouldn't be the same man walking out. Chapter 3. Back on the street. Reentry and Lucchese ties. Early 1960s. The city looked different, but the smell was the same. Hot asphalt, exhaust, and the faint trace of coffee drifting from corner diners that never closed. Brooklyn in the early 1960s was louder, faster, brighter. The kids wore slick hair and leather jackets. The music had changed, and men who once ruled the streets were now ghosts of another era. But not Paul Vario. He didn't come home to remember the past. He came home to rebuild the future. 8 years behind bars had stripped away his youth, but not his hunger. If anything, it had sharpened it into something colder, more deliberate. When he stepped off that prison bus in 1962, he was 48 years old and ready to reclaim what was his. He didn't announce his return. Men like Paul didn't need to. Word moved faster than the newspapers. Within days, whispers were spreading through the social clubs, pool halls, and small-time joints of Brooklyn. "Paulie's back," they said. The quiet one. The one who never talked. It was the highest form of respect in their world. Silence under pressure. He'd gone away young and come back a man who had proven himself the hard way. In the code of the streets that made him untouchable. The old Canari neighborhood hadn't changed much. Kids still played stickball under flickering streetlights. The corner bars still smelled like beer and regret. And everyone still knew who controlled which block. But now, the Lucchese family had grown into one of the most powerful organizations in the country. Tommy Lucchese, once a rising soldier Paul had met years earlier, was now the boss, calm, calculating, respected even by his enemies. When Paul returned, Tommy noticed. Men like Lucchese didn't forget loyalty, and they never wasted talent. Their reunion wasn't loud or sentimental. It was quiet, efficient, and, to the point, just like both men preferred. They met in a back room above a tailor shop in Little Italy, away from curious ears. The conversation was short, maybe 15 minutes. No promises, no oaths. Just mutual understanding. Lucchese needed men who could keep order, not chaos. Paul needed purpose, not attention. When he walked out of that meeting, he wasn't officially made yet, but his path was set. He began working under Lucchese's capo regime, handling gambling operations and loans in Brooklyn. At first, he kept it small. He wanted to feel the streets again, to understand how they'd changed. The city had grown more sophisticated, but crime had grown smarter too. The mob wasn't just street shakedowns anymore. It was businesses, unions, trucks, contracts. Power was hiding in plain sight now, behind desks and paperwork. Paul adapted quickly. He wasn't just a street thug. He was a strategist. He knew how to blend the old ways of intimidation with the new ways of influence. He opened a legitimate front, a small junkyard on Avenue D. It looked like nothing special. Piles of twisted metal, rusted cars, grease-stained workers. But behind the office door, the junkyard became the hub of his growing network. Men came and went with envelopes, cash, and whispers. Deals were made under the hum of machinery. It was perfect cover, noisy, filthy, and ordinary. No one looked twice. The junkyard became his fortress, a place where he could operate without drawing heat. Even the cops who drove by didn't realize that half the trucks they saw belonged to his crews. From there, Paul started rebuilding his own crew. Not just muscle, thinkers, earners, reliable men who knew how to stay quiet. Among them were a few young faces who would later become infamous. One of them was Jimmy Burke, known later as Jimmy the Gent. Half Irish, half demon, Burke was a thief with a talent for making money out of thin air and a smile that hit a temper like a loaded gun. Paul saw potential in him, not because he was violent, but because he was efficient. Jimmy never acted out of emotion. Every move was business. That's what Paul liked about him. Another was Henry Hill, a kid from Brownsville with slick charm and endless curiosity. Henry wasn't made material because of his Irish blood, but he was clever, adaptable, and loyal. He had a knack for finding angles in every situation. Paul liked him too. He saw in Henry a younger version of himself, hungry, eager to learn, but still naive about how deep the shadows ran. And then there was Tommy DeSimone, barely a man, all energy and ambition. Together, they formed the core of what would later become one of the most feared crews in New York. Paul's leadership style was simple but effective, control without chaos. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't need to wave a gun to make a point. One quiet look from him carried more weight than a dozen shouts from other bosses. He treated his men like family, but a family that knew its hierarchy. You earned your place. You followed the rules. And if you didn't, you vanished. He built his empire not through bloodshed, but through business. Trucking companies, construction, air freight, and the unions that tied them all together. Paul had his fingers in everything. He understood that the real money wasn't in street corner bookies anymore. It was in the arteries of the city, the flow of goods, labor, and contracts. He made friends in the Teamsters, in airport logistics, even in city permits. Everyone owed someone something, and somehow, all roads led back to him. But as organized as he was, Paul never forgot the lessons of Sing Sing. He knew that success drew eyes, from cops, rivals, even his own family. So he cultivated invisibility. He rarely appeared in photos, avoided flashy cars, and stayed out of headlines. He preferred a quiet dinner with trusted men over grand parties. His voice was low, his tone even. He was the opposite of the flamboyant gangsters Hollywood loved to imagine. That's why he lasted as long as he did, because he never needed the world to know his name. Still, success always carries shadows. The late nights at Gefkin's bar became ritual, smoke hanging in the air, money counted in the back room, laughter masking tension. The bar was technically owned by a friend, but everyone knew it was Paul's domain. It was there that new deals were born and old scores settled. The regulars knew when to leave, especially when Paul's inner circle arrived. They spoke softly, but the stakes were always high. Through the 60s, his power grew quietly, like vines spreading under the surface. He didn't seek headlines, but his influence touched everything from the racetracks to JFK Airport. If you wanted to move goods through certain terminals, you paid tribute. If you wanted your union contract approved, you talked to the right man, and those men answered to Paul. To outsiders, it looked like coincidence. To insiders, it was structure, the invisible architecture of control that only a few understood. But what truly made Paul different was his patience. He wasn't impulsive. He waited for moments to ripen, for opportunities to fall into his lap naturally. It made him seem almost prophetic. When competitors overextended, when younger hotheads got greedy, Paul stayed still, letting them burn themselves out. He'd quietly absorb their operations afterward, as if it had been planned all along. He was a chess player in a world full of dice throwers. There were moments, though, when cracks appeared behind that calm mask. Sometimes at night, after the bar closed, he'd linger with a glass of scotch, his eyes distant. He never talked about prison, but it was always there, the invisible weight in his silence. A few close friends said he had nightmares, though no one ever dared ask. Whatever ghosts haunted him, he kept them buried beneath layers of discipline. As his influence deepened, so did his reputation. Within the Lucchese family, he was now a made man, officially recognized and respected. His crew became known for being reliable, the kind of men who could be trusted with high-stakes jobs. Lucchese himself valued Paul's restraint. While other crews caused heat with public violence, Paul kept things clean, controlled, professional. He preferred manipulation over mayhem. It wasn't morality, it was efficiency. Blood drew cops, silence drew money. Still, the law was never blind for long. By the late 60s, federal agencies had started paying closer attention to the Mafia's growing economic influence. The FBI had begun wiretapping social clubs, tracking movements, building cases that would later reshape organized crime. Paul was careful, but the walls were tightening. He started using more layers, buffers between himself and the operations. He communicated through trusted men only, never over phones. Every message was verbal, every deal face-to-face. In an age before surveillance paranoia was common, Paul was already living like he was being watched. He often told his younger men something that became almost like gospel. The trick isn't staying out of trouble. The trick is making them forget you were ever there. It sounded cryptic at first, but those who understood it survived. It was his creed, invisibility is armor. By now, his junkyard operation had expanded into multiple fronts. There were trucking routes, auto shops, bars, and even a few legitimate small businesses that paid taxes on time. On paper, Paul was a hardworking businessman with a modest empire. In reality, every dollar that passed through his hands was part of a larger machine, a machine designed to keep him insulated, always one step removed from the dirt. His home life was quieter but complicated. He had a wife, sons, and daughters, but his true devotion was to the life. He tried to keep his family separate, though the lines blurred often. His sons admired him, but feared him too. They saw the men who came and went, the quiet conversations that ended with envelopes and handshakes. They knew better than to ask questions. To them, he wasn't just a father. He was a figure of power, something half mythical, half terrifying. The 60s rolled forward, and Brooklyn kept changing. The docks gave way to airports, the mob traded whiskey trucks for union contracts, and the city's skyline grew like ambition itself. Through it all, Paul adapted. He didn't just survive, he thrived. His influence at JFK Airport deepened, especially with the movement of cargo. Everything that landed or left that tarmac had invisible taxes attached to it. Pieces skimmed here, cuts taken there. No one said his name aloud, but everyone knew who controlled it. And yet, the more power he accumulated, the more he retreated into silence. He no longer needed to be present for every deal. His word carried across boroughs. He could sit in his bar, light a cigarette, and with one quiet nod decide the fate of a dozen men. Power had become second nature, and with it came an odd sort of loneliness, the kind only men who live double lives can understand. But even the calmest waters hide dangerous currents. Rivalries inside the family began to stir. Younger soldiers wanted faster money. Some whispered that Paul was old-fashioned, too cautious, too quiet for the new generation. He heard those whispers, but didn't react. He knew that time, not temper, kills faster. He'd survived prison, wars, and the rise and fall of a dozen street bosses. He wasn't about to lose sleep over impatient kids. Then came the turning point, a meeting that would unknowingly shape the next decade of his life. It was held in a small restaurant in Howard Beach. The lighting was dim, the room full of cigarette haze. Around the table sat men who would later be legends and ghosts. Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, and a few others who'd soon be bound by something bigger than any of them could predict. They discussed airport connections, cargo routes, money movement. It was business as usual, but beneath it, there was something electric, the sense that they were on the verge of something massive. Paul didn't talk much that night. He just listened, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. He could sense it, the energy, the greed, the hunger that filled the room. He knew how these things started, small, harmless, a whisper of opportunity. But he also knew how they ended, with blood, betrayal, and bodies buried where no one would find them. Still, he didn't stop it. He simply gave permission, a quiet nod. That nod would echo through history. By the time the 60s gave way to the 70s, Paul Vario had transformed from a neighborhood figure into one of the most powerful capos in New York. His influence was invisible but absolute. To outsiders, he was a simple businessman with a gravelly voice and tired eyes. To those in the know, he was the backbone of the Lucchese operations, the man who made sure everything ran smoothly, quietly, efficiently. But as history would soon prove, quiet empires can make the loudest explosions. And Paul, the man who built his life on patience, silence, and control, was about to watch his world spin faster than even he could manage. Because soon, the streets around JFK would hum with a different kind of noise. The kind that comes before chaos. The kind that makes even the quietest men raise their heads and listen. And for Paul Vario, the calm before the storm was almost over. Chapter 4. Building the Canari Crew. The night air in Brooklyn carried a hum, the sound of distant traffic, laughter from open windows, and somewhere, the soft metallic clink of bottles behind a bar. It was the early 1960s, and the city was a restless machine that never truly slept. In Canari, the streets had a rhythm of their own. Men in dark suits standing under flickering neon, deals made with handshakes and half-truths. It was here, among the cracked sidewalks and unspoken rules, that Paul Vario began to build what would become one of the most profitable and dangerous crews in the history of organized crime. A crew so disciplined, so quietly effective, that even other families looked at it with a mix of respect and caution. And at the center of it all was Paul, calm, reserved, the eye in the storm. It started small, as most empires do. Paul didn't recruit men. He selected them. Every person who came under his wing had something specific: skill, loyalty, or nerve. Sometimes all three. He built slowly, carefully, like a craftsman fitting pieces of a puzzle only he could see. The junkyard on Avenue D was the foundation. It looked ordinary: rusted cars stacked high, mechanics covered in grease, the faint smell of gasoline in the air. But behind its dented gates, business thrived. It wasn't just a front, it was a command center. Trucks came and went at odd hours. Drivers dropped envelopes through back doors. And beneath the noise of engines and metal, money flowed quietly, invisibly. By day it was a business. By night, it was the heartbeat of a criminal operation that touched nearly every hustle in Brooklyn. The men who worked there respected Paul not because he yelled or waved a gun, but because he didn't need to. He had a way of looking at you. A steady, unreadable stare that made you want to tell the truth even when you shouldn't. His silence was more powerful than any threat. In a world built on fear, he built on control. The Canari crew wasn't defined by one racket. It was a collection of many, each designed to feed the others. Gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, extortion, nothing flashy, nothing sloppy. Paul's genius was in organization. He created a network where every crime supported another. The guy running numbers knew the guy at the docks, who knew the guy at the airport, who knew a union official willing to look the other way. It was like a spider web, delicate but deadly. Pull one thread, and the whole system reacted. At the center of that web were three men who would make the Vario crew infamous: Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, and Tommy DeSimone. Each one different, each one dangerous in his own way. Jimmy was the moneymaker, the architect of hustles. He had charm, intelligence, and a temper that came without warning. Henry was the connector, the middleman who could move between street thugs and millionaires with equal ease. He had a gift for conversation, the kind that made people trust him before they realized they shouldn't. And Tommy, Tommy was chaos wrapped in a smile. Young, unpredictable, with eyes that never blinked long enough to show conscience. Together, under Paul's watchful eye, they became something more than criminals. They became a machine. Paul understood how to manage men like that. He gave them freedom, but within limits. He let them make money, as long as his cut came first. He didn't interfere in their day-to-day business unless he had to. But when he spoke, everyone listened. He didn't waste words, and he never repeated himself. That was the rule. You didn't make Paul repeat. Those who did were quietly erased from the picture, sometimes transferred, sometimes vanished. It was never personal. It was structure. His control reached far beyond Canari. Through connections with the Lucchese family, Paul expanded his influence into unions and airports. JFK Airport, then still called Idlewild, became a gold mine. Thousands of trucks, millions in cargo, and no real oversight. It was the perfect storm for men who knew how to make things disappear. With the right union men on the payroll and the right guards looking away, entire shipments could vanish into thin air, replaced by silence and envelopes of cash. The beauty of it was in the simplicity. No gunfire, no witnesses, no noise. Just trucks that left and never arrived. Paul made sure his crew understood one principle above all. Violence was a last resort. It wasn't morality. It was business. Violence drew attention, and attention brought heat. He preferred precision, bribes over bullets, strategy over spectacle. But when force became necessary, it was swift and final. He had men for that, professionals who didn't flinch, didn't brag, didn't get caught. Brooklyn was full of loud gangsters back then. Men who made headlines, chased fame, and ended up in coffins. Paul wasn't one of them. He was the shadow in the photograph, the quiet figure in the corner no one noticed until it was too late. Gefkin's bar became his social club, the unofficial headquarters of the Canari crew. It wasn't fancy, just dim lights, wood paneling, and a jukebox that never seemed to work right. But every night, it was alive. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like fog, glasses clinked softly, and deals unfolded at every table. If you walked in without an invitation, you didn't walk in twice. The regulars knew who sat where. Jimmy usually took the booth by the wall. Henry handled the phone near the back, and Paul sat near the bar, quiet, observant, always in control. It was the kind of place where laughter meant danger and silence meant respect. The crew thrived. Hijackings became routine, loan payments steady, gambling dens profitable. The police knew something was happening, but couldn't pin anything down. Every time they tried, their witnesses disappeared or their evidence crumbled. Paul's discipline protected him. He never wrote things down, never spoke over phones, never left fingerprints. Even his closest men didn't know everything. He believed knowledge was risk. The less a man knew, the safer the operation. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. But beneath the surface of success, cracks were forming, not in Paul's control, but in the men around him. Jimmy's temper was growing harder to manage. Henry was drinking more, chasing danger as much as profit. Tommy was unpredictable, his violence spilling beyond what was necessary. Paul saw it all. He could read men like newspapers, and he knew trouble when he saw it. But he also knew he needed them. They were his earners, the backbone of his empire. He told himself he could contain them. That was the lie every boss told before things spiraled. Still, for most of the 60s, business boomed. Money came fast, easy, endless. Paul diversified, investing in bars, trucking companies, and even restaurants. Everything was part legitimate, part not. It blurred so seamlessly that even accountants couldn't separate clean from dirty. His name, when spoken in quiet corners, carried weight. To those in the know, he was no longer just a capo. He was a system within a system, the man who made Brooklyn run smoothly while others made noise uptown. Sometimes, late at night, Paul would drive alone through the streets he grew up on. The old tenements were gone, replaced by apartment blocks and supermarkets. The world had moved forward, but he hadn't. He'd built his life around a code, loyalty, discipline, silence, and he believed in it as if it were law. But as he looked at the glowing city skyline, he sometimes wondered if the code still meant anything to the new generation. The younger guys talked more, bragged more, trusted too easily. They forgot that the real power was in being unseen. There were moments of quiet reflection, sitting at Gefkin's with a drink, watching the younger men laugh, knowing they'd never understand how fragile it all was. The underworld was a balance of greed and fear. Too much of one, and the whole thing collapsed. Paul was old enough to remember the bloodbaths of the Prohibition era, the chaos when greed went unchecked. He swore he'd never let that happen under his watch. But even he couldn't stop time. The 60s turned into the 70s, and the money grew faster than ever. The Canari crew controlled everything from card games to construction bids. Every dollar that passed through the neighborhood was touched by them in some way. The junkyard now handled more than metal. It handled secrets, debts, and silence. It became a meeting ground for men who wanted to make problems disappear. Paul sat at the top of it all, orchestrating from behind his calm eyes. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman with connections. To those who knew better, he was the quiet godfather of Canari, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to end an argument. And yet, the pressure was building. The FBI was changing tactics, learning the language of organized crime. They weren't just chasing street crimes anymore. They were mapping hierarchies, tapping phones, infiltrating unions. For the first time, the old ways weren't enough. Paul adapted. He started using coded language, rotating meeting places, relying more on face-to-face contact. He became even quieter, blending deeper into the background. He was too smart to get caught in the open. But while he kept his head down, the younger men around him were getting reckless. Jimmy was pulling bigger scores, hijacking trucks that carried goods worth fortunes. Henry was running point on everything, coordinating drivers and deliveries, making sure Paul's cut arrived clean. Tommy, however, was becoming a liability. His temper and love of chaos were drawing heat, and Paul knew that sooner or later, the boy's recklessness would light a fire too big to control. One evening, in the back of the junkyard, Paul called Jimmy and Henry into his office. The door closed softly, the room dim except for the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He spoke quietly, his voice steady. "You keep the heat off," he said. "I don't care how much money there is. If it brings attention, it's bad business." The two men nodded, but Paul could see it in their eyes. They were too far gone into the thrill of it all. Money was a drug, and they were hooked. Outside, the world kept moving. The Lucchese family's operations expanded, the city's corruption deepened, and Paul's power solidified. But deep inside, he sensed something shifting. The streets felt different now, colder, hungrier. The old loyalty was fading, replaced by greed and ego. He didn't show it, but it worried him. He'd built his crew on discipline, and discipline was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Still, to anyone watching, Paul seemed untouchable. He was respected by his peers, feared by rivals, and admired by his men. He had money, power, and control, but he also had enemies he couldn't see: law enforcement, informants, even time itself. The cracks were widening, though he refused to admit it. The empire he'd built with silence and precision was standing on invisible fault lines. And somewhere in the heart of Brooklyn, a plan was beginning to take shape, one that would change everything. A plan involving an airport, millions in unmarked bills, and the kind of opportunity no criminal could resist. It would become the stuff of legend. But for now, in those quiet years before it all erupted, Paul Vario sat in his bar, glass in hand, the jukebox humming faintly behind him, unaware that his careful world was about to spin out of control. He had spent decades mastering patience, building order from chaos. But soon, chaos would come knocking on his door. And this time, even the quiet godfather of Canari wouldn't be able to silence it. Chapter 5. Airport Economy. Seizing the cargo rackets. The wind that swept across JFK Airport in the early 1970s carried more than the scent of jet fuel and ocean air. It carried opportunity, the kind only a man like Paul Vario could recognize. To most people, The airport was just another piece of the city, a sprawling maze of terminals, warehouses, and cargo bays. To Paul, it was something else entirely. It was a gold mine hiding in plain sight, a place where millions of dollars in goods moved every day: cash, jewelry, electronics, and liquor, with little more than a paper trail to protect them. The world saw progress, global trade, the modern economy. Paul saw an open door, and he had the men to walk right through it. By the time the decade began, the Canari crew had already outgrown Brooklyn's backstreets. They didn't just control local gambling and loan sharking anymore. They had their hands in the arteries of New York's commerce. Trucks, shipping docks, and now air cargo. It was all part of the same system, just on a grander scale. The airport was the perfect racket: loud, busy, and full of people who minded their own business. Paul didn't need violence or chaos to take control. All he needed was patience, precision, and a few well-placed friends in the right uniforms. The connection started small: a few baggage handlers, a foreman, maybe a union man or two. Paul understood human nature better than most. He knew that everyone wanted something: a little extra money, a promotion, a favor. He used those ones like tools. A few $100s slipped into the right hands, and doors started opening. Soon, the crew had access to warehouses, storage manifests, and loading schedules. They knew which shipments were valuable before they even arrived. It wasn't about stealing everything. It was about knowing exactly what to steal. Jimmy Burke handled most of the airport work. Paul trusted him with it completely. Jimmy had a genius for logistics. He could move stolen goods like a freight company without ever filling out a form. The men called it busting out cargo, but it was cleaner than that. Boxes disappeared from the system, paperwork was adjusted, and by the time anyone noticed, the goods were already sold, the cash divided, the evidence gone. It was theft disguised as efficiency. Henry Hill often described the airport as their playground. At night, the runways glowed like veins of gold, and the warehouses buzzed with forklifts and voices. The crew moved like ghosts, slipping in and out without a sound. Sometimes they'd hit small shipments: liquor, cigarettes, or fur coats. Other times, it was bigger: boxes of cash, jewelry, or electronics straight from overseas. The money was good, but what made it better was how safe it felt. There were no alarms, no guns, no witnesses, just business. Paul oversaw everything from a distance. He didn't need to step foot inside the airport to own it. His men gave him reports, envelopes came in on schedule, and if someone got too curious, a reminder was quietly delivered. He kept the operation disciplined, structured, almost corporate. In a way, it was corporate, just without the stockholders. He even used legitimate trucking companies to move the stolen goods. The lines between lawful and unlawful blurred until even the FBI couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. To the Lucchese family, this new revenue stream was a revelation. The airport was safer than the streets, and the profits dwarfed what traditional rackets made. Lucchese himself had long understood the value of unions and transportation, but what Paul and his crew accomplished elevated it to an art form. They didn't just steal, they managed, taxed, and controlled an entire system. Everyone who wanted a piece of airport business had to go through them. And if you didn't, your trucks stopped moving, your workers stopped showing up, and your shipments mysteriously vanished. The genius of it all was that nobody outside their circle even realized how deep it went. The FBI called it racketeering, but to Paul, it was economics. He didn't see himself as a thief. He saw himself as a manager, someone who understood how money really moved in America. The airport wasn't just a location. It was a symbol of post-war capitalism, a machine designed to move wealth quickly and quietly. All Paul did was step in and redirect a little of that flow. But with great opportunity came greater risk. Every new connection was a potential leak. Paul knew that no matter how well a system ran, one careless word, one greedy move, could bring it all down. He drilled this into his men constantly. You don't talk. You don't show off. You don't exist. That was his creed. The Canari crew didn't need fame. Their success depended on being invisible. And for a long time it worked. The money was endless. Each month brought new envelopes, thicker and heavier. The bars in Brooklyn overflowed with cash, laughter, and quiet confidence. Jimmy's guys were buying cars, Henry was buying suits, and everyone was eating better than they ever had. But Paul stayed the same. He wore the same simple suits, drove modest cars, and never flaunted wealth. That was part of his control, never letting success make you sloppy. While others celebrated, Paul kept his eyes open. The crew's power extended far beyond theft. They began controlling the unions that represented the airport workers. That was the real key. Through those unions, Paul could dictate who got hired, who got fired, who worked overtime, and who got paid under the table. It gave him leverage over companies worth millions. If a shipping company wanted their cargo to move smoothly, they paid tribute. If they didn't, delays and accidents started happening. It was coercion disguised as negotiation, and it worked perfectly. But even as the system grew, tension simmered underneath. Jimmy Burke's ambition was boundless. He saw the airport as his domain and wanted full autonomy. Paul trusted him, but never fully let go of the reins. He'd seen too many men lose everything by trusting too deeply. The two men respected each other, but it was a fragile peace. Paul's calm authority met Jimmy's restless energy like two tectonic plates pressed together. It worked, until it didn't. In the early 70s, a few small jobs went wrong. A guard talked, a driver got spooked, a truck was found abandoned. The cops began asking questions, and for the first time, the crew felt the chill of real heat. Paul responded the only way he knew how, quietly. He shut down a few operations, relocated others, and reminded his men of the rules. You keep your mouth shut, you keep your job, he said. You don't, you disappear. It wasn't a threat, it was procedure. Henry Hill once said that being under Paul was like working for a strict but fair father. He didn't yell when you made mistakes, but you knew you disappointed him. And that was worse than any punishment. His power didn't come from fear, it came from expectation. Every man under him wanted to prove he was worthy of Paul's trust. That was the kind of loyalty that built empires and destroyed them. The airport jobs kept evolving. Soon, they weren't just hijacking goods, they were manipulating entire shipping routes. Trucks loaded with cargo would vanish, only to reappear days later, accidentally misplaced. Insurance payouts were filed, money changed hands, and everyone profited. It was an ecosystem of corruption, and Paul's crew sat comfortably at its center. One of the biggest innovations came from Jimmy himself, a system of inside men who handled all the logistics from within the airlines. They were workers, yes, but also soldiers in disguise. They'd signal which shipments were valuable, unlock doors, and even forge documents. No one outside the circle knew how deep it went. Even when investigators began sniffing around, they couldn't find the source. The operation was too layered, too disciplined. For Paul, the key was distance. He never appeared near the action, never spoke about jobs directly. He used coded language, vague phrases, and intermediaries. If something went wrong, the trail stopped long before it reached him. That separation saved him more than once. When the FBI started mapping connections between the Lucchese family and the airport rackets, Paul's name appeared only in whispers. He was the man behind the curtain, seen by everyone, known by no one. But success has a way of breeding overconfidence. The younger men began taking bigger risks. They were flush with money, drunk on their own legend. To them, the airport felt invincible, untouchable. And in that illusion of safety, small cracks began to form. A word spoken too loudly in a bar. A favor done for the wrong person. A name mentioned over a phone line. The kind of mistakes Paul had spent his life avoiding were now creeping into his empire. He noticed, and it worried him. One night, sitting in the back office of Gefkin's bar, Paul watched as Henry and Jimmy argued over money. It started small, percentages, shares, timing. But underneath, Paul sensed something deeper, ego. The kind that destroyed partnerships. He let them finish before speaking. You both forget, he said quietly. The money don't mean nothing if you can't spend it free. They nodded, embarrassed, but Paul knew the truth. Greed was already eating away at the edges of his control. Still, the operation continued to thrive. By the mid-70s, the Canari crew was moving millions of dollars through the airport rackets. They had so much cash that they didn't even know what to do with it. It piled up in bags and boxes, stuffed into closets and basements. Henry later joked that they lost money because they couldn't count it fast enough. But beneath the laughter was a truth no one wanted to admit. It couldn't last forever. Law enforcement was evolving, and the Bureau was getting smarter. New faces were joining the investigations. Men who weren't swayed by bribes or intimidation. They studied patterns, traced bank accounts, and started connecting dots. The mob was no longer invisible. It was being mapped. And in that growing web of names and numbers, Paul's world was starting to take shape under fluorescent lights in FBI offices. But he didn't panic. He'd been through worse. He'd survived prison, betrayal, and decades of shifting alliances. He believed he could outlast this too. After all, he wasn't the one stealing. He was the one managing. He'd built his empire on silence and discipline, and he trusted that would protect him. What he couldn't see, what none of them could, was how close the storm really was. Because among his own men, loyalty was starting to crack. Henry was restless. Jimmy was reckless. And the airport that had made them rich was about to become their downfall. Within a few short years, one job, one spectacular, impossible, perfect job, would bring everything crashing down. But for now, the machines roared, the planes soared, and money flowed through the veins of the airport like lifeblood. And in a quiet bar miles away, Paul Vario lifted a glass, unaware that the empire he'd built from silence was about to echo across history with the loudest crime New York had ever heard. The countdown had already begun to a night of stolen millions, missing men, and the sound of the walls closing in. The world would remember it as the Lufthansa heist. But for Paul, it would be remembered as the moment the quiet godfather of Canari finally found himself standing in the noise. What none of them realized was that the heist would become the single most infamous robbery in American history, and the beginning of their downfall. In the weeks leading up to the job, Jimmy's crew prepared with almost military precision. They gathered equipment, secured vehicles, studied guard rotations. Paul stayed distant, managing the broader Lucchese operations and keeping his name far from the whispers surrounding the airport. He trusted Jimmy's ability to deliver, and Jimmy did. On the cold morning of December 11th, 1978, a group of masked men entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal. In just under an hour, they executed one of the cleanest robberies in criminal history. No alarms, no witnesses, no mistakes. When it was over, they walked away with nearly $6 million in cash and jewels, the equivalent of over $20 million in today's money. It was staggering. News of the heist spread like wildfire across the city. Newspapers called it the crime of the century. The FBI scrambled. But for Paul and his crew, the celebration was quiet, private. They'd done it. They had stolen a piece of American legend. Yet, beneath the thrill, Paul felt unease. He knew too much about human nature to believe that this kind of money wouldn't cause problems. Big scores rarely brought peace. They brought greed, fear, and blood. In his long years in the life, he'd seen it time and again. The higher the payout, the shorter the lifespan of those involved. Jimmy was elated, but his joy carried that dangerous glint in his eyes. The glint of a man who didn't trust anyone enough to share the reward. Within weeks, the cracks began to show. The men who'd taken part in the job started spending money too quickly. New cars, jewelry, mink coats for girlfriends. It was a violation of the unspoken rule. After a score that big, you lay low. Jimmy saw the spending, and paranoia took hold. He began eliminating loose ends, one by one. Men vanished, buried in lots, stuffed in cars, dumped in rivers. The celebration turned into a massacre. And as the bodies piled up, Paul's fear turned into realization. He'd seen greed destroy empires before, but never this fast, never this violently. The FBI swarmed the airport, interrogating anyone connected to the cargo terminal. The pressure was suffocating. Henry Hill, once full of bravado, started to crack. The investigation stretched into every part of their network: the unions, the trucking companies, even Paul's beloved junkyard. For years, his operations had existed in a careful balance of control and invisibility. Now, everything was under a magnifying glass. Paul tried to distance himself from the heist. He hadn't planned it, hadn't touched the money, but the connection was undeniable. Jimmy was his man, the airport was his territory, and the Lucchese family expected accountability. He did what he'd always done: stayed silent, played the long game, and hoped time would bury the noise. But the noise kept growing. The newspapers wouldn't let it die, the FBI wouldn't back off, and the streets wouldn't stop whispering. Meanwhile, Jimmy's paranoia deepened. He started suspecting everyone, even Henry. He'd become a man haunted by his own brilliance. The money that was supposed to bring freedom brought only fear. Paul watched from a distance, helpless to control it now. The machine he'd built, once flawless, was spinning out of control. The quiet structure he'd created, where loyalty and silence ruled, was crumbling under the weight of ego and greed. For decades, Paul Vario had been the master of calm, the man who ruled through patience and silence. But now he was trapped in the noise. He saw what was coming: the arrests, the betrayals, the trials. He'd survived everything before: prison, rivals, law enforcement, but this felt different. This time, the danger wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside his own circle. Late one evening, Henry walked into Gefkin's bar looking pale and nervous. He'd been drinking, his hands shaking. Paul looked up from his seat, studying him. "You look sick," he said softly. Henry forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He knew, deep down, that the walls were closing in. He could feel the FBI breathing down his neck. Paul didn't ask questions. He already knew the truth. One of his own was going to flip. In the months that followed, Henry Hill would make the decision that shattered everything. He'd become an informant, testifying against the very men who had made him. And with that, the quiet empire Paul Vario had built over decades would begin to unravel, thread by thread. But in 1975, none of that had happened yet. Not the heist, not the betrayals, not the downfall. In that dimly lit bar, as the jukebox hummed and laughter filled the air, Paul and Jimmy still believed they were untouchable. They sat across from each other, two sides of the same coin, one quiet and patient, the other bold and reckless. Both blind to the fact that their partnership, the empire they'd built together, was already carrying the seed of its destruction. The Burr connection had made them rich beyond imagination, but it would also become the fault line that split everything open. For now, though, they raised their glasses, toasting the silence they'd mistaken for safety, unaware that somewhere in that silence, the first echoes of the end were already beginning to whisper. Chapter 6: The Burr Connection. The night was cold, the kind of winter chill that bit through even the thickest coat. A thin mist hung over Brooklyn streets, and a black sedan idled outside Gefkin's bar, its headlights off, engine humming quietly. Inside, laughter echoed against the wood-paneled walls, low, masculine, laced with the weight of money and whiskey. It was 1975, and the air felt electric. Men leaned close to speak in whispers, ashtrays overflowed, and the jukebox played a half-broken Sinatra tune. At the center of it all, in a corner booth beneath the yellow light, sat two men who didn't need to say much to understand each other: Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke. One was the quiet architect of order, the other a brilliant storm. Together, they were about to rewrite the rules of organized crime. They had met years earlier, through the rhythm of the streets. One a Lucchese capo, the other an Irish moneymaker with the instincts of a general. Paul had seen hundreds of hustlers come and go, but Jimmy was different. He was calm where others were reckless, charming where others were crude, and ruthless when it mattered. He understood the art of business disguised as crime. To Paul, that made him invaluable. Jimmy was the kind of man who could turn opportunity into empire if he was given the right leash. And Paul, cautious but shrewd, gave him just enough slack to build something big, while keeping one hand always on the rope. Jimmy had built a crew around himself that reflected his own contradictions: loyal, unpredictable, and dangerously efficient. There was Henry Hill, the talkative kid who could sell ice to an Eskimo and never seemed to stop smiling. There was Tommy DeSimone, a walking powder keg, unpredictable but effective when the job required fear. And then there were the quiet earners, the truck drivers, the inside men at JFK Airport, all woven into a system that Paul technically owned, but Jimmy ran with near-military precision. Their partnership was the perfect balance of brains and brutality. Paul never needed to raise his voice with Jimmy. Their conversations were always brief, almost cryptic. They shared an understanding. Paul created the conditions. Jimmy created the cash. It wasn't friendship. It was alignment. And for years, it worked flawlessly. Jimmy's operations filled Paul's envelopes faster than any other crew in the Lucchese family. Week after week, money poured in from hijackings, gambling, and airport jobs. Paul didn't need to ask questions. He trusted Jimmy to keep the money flowing and the trouble minimal. It was a trust built on mutual benefit and mutual fear. The real brilliance of Jimmy Burke wasn't just in stealing. It was in management. He ran his crew like a corporation, with hierarchy, delegation, and rewards. Everyone had a role. Everyone knew the rules. But beneath that smooth structure, there was volatility. Jimmy's temper was legendary, his paranoia equally so. He smiled like a movie star, but when he suspected betrayal, his charm evaporated, replaced by cold calculation. Paul recognized that darkness in him. He'd seen it before, in himself, decades earlier, when he first started running the streets of Brooklyn. As the mid-70s rolled on, their partnership expanded. The airport rackets were generating enormous profit, and both men could feel that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. Cargo thefts became more sophisticated. The crew had informants in nearly every department: airline employees, customs agents, warehouse workers. The information flowed like currency, and Jimmy turned it into gold. The operation became so efficient that it seemed unstoppable. Trucks were hijacked with surgical precision, schedules predicted, and shipments vanished without a trace. But as the money grew, so did ambition. Jimmy began thinking bigger. He wanted more than just hijackings and small scores. He wanted the kind of job that would be remembered forever, a score so massive it would set him, Paul, and everyone else for life. And as fate would have it, the opportunity was already forming in the background, in the dark corners of the Lufthansa air cargo terminal. The Lufthansa vault was one of the most secure facilities at JFK, holding millions in cash flown in from overseas banks. It was supposed to be untouchable, but Jimmy's men had inside information, courtesy of Henry Hill and a few underpaid night workers who liked easy money. They knew the schedules, the guards, the procedures. They knew when the vault was fullest. It was the kind of inside knowledge that could only come from months of observation and quiet bribery. When Henry brought the idea to Jimmy, the Irishman saw it immediately. This was the crown jewel. Paul wasn't told right away. Jimmy and Henry wanted to keep the circle small until they had everything in place. But even without being directly involved, Paul's shadow loomed over every conversation. Nothing of that magnitude could move forward without his silent approval. Everyone understood that the airport was his domain, and nothing happened there unless he allowed it. So when Jimmy finally mentioned the plan, Paul listened quietly, his face unreadable. He didn't need details. He just asked one question. "You can keep it clean?" Jimmy nodded. That was enough. The nod wasn't permission in the formal sense, but it was as close as Paul ever came to blessing a job. Chapter 7. The Hill Years. The sound of laughter echoed through Gefkin's bar, the kind that came from men who thought they'd beaten the world. Cigarette smoke swirled beneath the low ceiling, turning the air into a hazy veil that hid the tension behind every smile. In the corner, Paul Vario sat with his drink untouched, eyes calm, watching his men like a chess player observing his board. Around him, the faces that had made him rich: Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, and Henry Hill talked, argued, boasted, and laughed as if they were invincible. To the outside world, they looked like just another group of blue-collar guys blowing off steam after work. But inside these walls, they were the heartbeat of the Lucchese family's Brooklyn empire, and Henry Hill was fast becoming the face of it. Henry was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and make them feel like they'd known him their whole lives. He wasn't the toughest or the smartest, but he had something far more valuable: charm. He made people feel seen, and in a world built on fear, that was a dangerous gift. Paul had noticed it early, back when Henry was still running errands, carrying envelopes, and doing the small jobs nobody else wanted. He saw how Henry moved, always smiling, always confident, never rattled. In a neighborhood full of men trying to look tough, Henry made himself likable, and that made him useful. By the early 1970s, Henry had become one of Paul's most trusted associates. Not because he was made, he couldn't be, being half Irish, but because he had the ear of everyone who mattered. Henry could talk to Jimmy, handle Tommy, and even smooth things over with the union guys when they got nervous. He was the glue that kept volatile men working together. And for Paul, that was priceless. Running an empire built on silence required someone who could speak for him when he chose not to. Henry became that voice. Life under Paul was unlike anything Henry had ever known. It wasn't just about money, though there was plenty of it. It was about belonging. He'd grown up watching these men, the suits, the cars, the respect, and now he was one of them. He'd wake up each morning not knowing whether the day would bring a quiet drink or a stack of cash big enough to choke a man. For a kid from Brownsville, it was everything he'd ever dreamed of. And Paul, for all his strictness, gave Henry room to move. He trusted him with tasks that required delicacy, smoothing over disputes, arranging payoffs, and keeping the airport racket running clean. Henry's wife, Karen, saw the transformation too. The kid she'd married, restless, ambitious, charming, had become something else, something darker. Their house in Rockville Center was filled with nice things. Cars lined the driveway, and expensive suits hung in the closet. But every knock at the door made her flinch. Every late-night phone call made her hold her breath. Henry always told her not to worry, that everything was under control, and she believed him because he made her want to. But somewhere deep down, she knew that this life, this illusion of stability, was built on secrets that couldn't last forever. Paul had a soft spot for Henry. He treated him like a son, though he'd never say it aloud. He saw potential in him, not to lead, but to earn. And in the mob, earners were gold. Henry's operation expanded beyond the airport. He ran gambling rings, moved stolen goods, and even got into drug trafficking on the side, something Paul had explicitly forbidden. The old man saw drugs as poison, not just to the streets, but to the integrity of their world. Drugs brought addicts, addicts brought informants, and informants brought death. Paul's rule was simple: no drugs, ever. But Henry, chasing bigger money and faster thrills, couldn't resist. He thought he could keep it hidden. He thought wrong. The 70s were good to them. Too good. The Canari crew was making more money than ever before. The bars were packed, the envelopes fat, and the police paid to look the other way. They threw parties that lasted all weekend, where whiskey flowed like water and laughter drowned out the sound of consequence. Even Paul, usually reserved, allowed himself moments of pride. He had built something stable, something lasting. The Lucchese family thrived because of men like him, disciplined, strategic, loyal. And under his command, the Brooklyn wing of the family ran smoother than ever. But success has a way of numbing instinct. The more money they made, the more they forgot how fragile it all was. Henry's life spiraled into excess. Nights blurred into mornings. Deals blurred into betrayals. The lines between business and pleasure vanished. He'd sit in Gefkin's with a drink in one hand and paranoia in the other, talking too much, trusting the wrong people. Paul noticed. He always noticed. The quiet capo would watch him, eyes heavy, saying nothing but thinking everything. There were still moments of warmth. Sunday dinners at Paul's house were legendary. Big meals, laughter, the illusion of family. Karen would sit beside Henry, watching Paul at the head of the table, his sons and soldiers around him, everyone playing their part in the ritual. It looked like unity, like loyalty. But beneath it all, everyone was calculating who owed who was rising, who was falling. The mob family was like any other family, except love was replaced by leverage. The cracks began to show after the Lufthansa heist. The job was a masterpiece, but its aftermath poisoned everything. The violence that followed, the paranoia, the whispers, it changed the crew forever. Henry tried to act normal, but the fear was visible. He knew Jimmy was eliminating loose ends, and he knew he could be next. Paul, meanwhile, found himself caught between loyalty and self-preservation. The FBI's pressure was mounting. His men were being watched, their phones tapped, their meetings recorded. He'd spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight, and now, through no fault of his own, it was blinding him. Henry became reckless. He was using cocaine heavily, dealing behind Paul's back, and bringing in people who didn't belong. He still made money, but it came with noise, the kind Paul despised. The junkyard, once a fortress of secrecy, now felt exposed. Too many cars, too many faces, too many questions. Paul warned him, gently at first, then with more weight. "You're slipping," he said one night, his tone even but his eyes cold. "You start making noise, people start listening." Henry promised to straighten out, but deep down, he knew he couldn't. The addiction had its claws in him now. The thrill, the danger, the illusion of control. When the FBI finally started closing in, they didn't come through the front door. They came through whispers, informants, tapes, surveillance, the invisible threads Paul had always feared. One by one, men were arrested, questioned, turned. The walls were closing in, and the silence that had protected them for so long was starting to crack. Henry could feel it. Every phone call felt like a trap. Every shadow looked like an agent. He started to panic. Paul stayed calm, even as the storm gathered around him. He'd lived through chaos before, but this time was different. This wasn't a war between families or a rivalry on the streets. This was a new kind of war, one fought in courtrooms, with microphones and witnesses instead of guns. And no matter how quiet he stayed, the noise was getting closer. Henry's arrest in 1980 put the final nail in the coffin. He'd been caught moving drugs, and the charges were serious. Facing years in prison and fearing for his life, he made the decision that would destroy everything. He flipped. The golden boy, the talker, the charmer, now the government's star witness. When Paul heard the news, he didn't shout, didn't curse. He just sat in silence, the weight of decades pressing down on him. Betrayal, in their world, wasn't just treachery. It was death. The day Henry took the stand, Paul's empire began to crumble. The testimony was devastating, detailed, confident, impossible to refute. Every secret, every coded word, every hidden deal was laid bare. Years of careful invisibility undone by one man's fear. For Paul, it was almost poetic. He'd built an empire on silence, and now it was destroyed by the one man who never knew how to stop talking. As the trials dragged on, Paul began to fade. The man who once ruled Brooklyn's underworld with quiet authority now sat in courtrooms, listening as the life he'd built was dissected piece by piece. His health began to fail, his calm eroded by exhaustion. Prison didn't scare him anymore. He'd survived worse, but this felt different. It wasn't just his body behind bars. It was his legacy. Everything he'd done to maintain control, to avoid chaos, had ended in the very chaos he'd always feared. In his final days of freedom, he spent more time alone at the junkyard, sitting in his office, staring at the mountains of twisted metal outside. He'd built this place as a symbol of order, turning junk into profit, chaos into structure. Now it looked like a reflection of his own life. Broken, rusted, left behind. The men he'd raised, trusted, and protected were gone. Some dead, some missing, some testifying. The laughter that once filled the bar, The energy of those nights had been replaced by silence. Not the comforting kind he'd always controlled, but the empty kind that followed loss. Henry Hill would go on to live, hidden under a new name, telling stories about the life he'd once lived. The world would turn those stories into movies, books, and myths. The names would change, the faces blurred, but the truth remained. They'd all wanted to live forever, and instead, they became cautionary tales. Paul never lived to see the legend that would grow from his ashes. He went quietly, as he had lived, fading in a prison hospital bed in 1988. But long before that, he'd already died in spirit. The moment he realized that silence, his greatest weapon, couldn't protect him from the noise of betrayal. And somewhere, in the fading echoes of those Brooklyn nights, you can almost still hear the laughter of men who thought they'd beaten the world, before the world reminded them that in this life, every secret eventually finds its voice. Chapter 8. First Big Fall. The 1973 Tax Evasion Case. The morning Paul Vario walked into the courthouse in 1973, the winter air bit sharp against his skin. He moved slowly, not from fear, but from habit. A man like him never hurried, not even when the world was watching. The cameras clicked, reporters shouted questions, but he didn't look up. He just kept walking, his overcoat brushing against the marble steps, as if this was another day at work, another performance in the quiet theater of survival. For years, he had watched other men fall, loud, reckless, careless, and he'd always told himself he was different. But now, with the federal government staring him down, even the quiet Godfather of Canari could feel the walls inching closer. The charge seemed almost laughable at first. Tax evasion. For a man who'd controlled half of Brooklyn's underworld, who'd made millions off hijackings, unions, and airport rackets, the idea that his downfall might come for paperwork felt absurd. But Paul understood the message immediately. The government had learned that it couldn't outgun the Mafia. It had to outthink it. Al Capone had been the warning from another era, and now, decades later, the same method was coming for him. They didn't need to catch him with blood on his hands or stolen cash in his pocket. All they needed was math. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was clinical. The prosecution didn't talk about murders, robberies, or extortion. They talked about numbers, income unreported, expenses unexplained, money that didn't exist on paper. To them, it wasn't about morality. It was about arithmetic. Paul sat at the defense table, listening to the monotone rhythm of accountants describing his life in ledgers. To them, he wasn't a man. He was a column of figures. Every dollar they mentioned felt like a small betrayal, proof that his years of caution, his discipline, had a crack somewhere. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, he'd survived by being invisible, meticulous, careful. But even the quietest man leaves footprints. Every envelope that passed through his hands, every car that left the junkyard, every deal disguised as legitimate business, it all left a trace. The FBI had learned to follow silence the way a hunter follows scent. They didn't come through the front door of his empire. They slipped in through the paperwork. His lawyer, a sharp man with slicked back hair and a rehearsed confidence, whispered that they could fight it. But Paul wasn't naive. He'd seen enough trials to know when the verdict had already been written. The government wasn't after fines or small punishments. They wanted a trophy, a Lucchese capo behind bars, a symbol that no one was untouchable. And though Paul had no illusions about justice, he respected strategy. He could almost admire the efficiency of it. When the sentence came, 6 years, Paul didn't blink. The courtroom murmured, reporters scribbled, but he just nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already decided. He was let out in cuffs, expression unreadable, shoulders straight. There was no outburst, no defiance, just silence. It wasn't the first time he'd worn shackles, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time was different. This wasn't a fall from power through violence or betrayal. It was bureaucracy that brought him down. Paper, ink, and patience. In prison, the air smelled of disinfectant and regret. Paul recognized the rhythm immediately, the routines, the the codes, the quiet bargains made in hallways. It was a place he understood too well, but now it felt heavier. He wasn't a young man anymore. His hair had thinned, his body had thickened, and his lungs carried the faint wheeze of age. Yet even here, his reputation followed him. Guards looked at him with curiosity, other inmates with reverence. He was the quiet one, the man from Brooklyn who'd built an empire out of stillness. He kept mostly to himself. Every morning he walked the yard slowly, hands in pockets, eyes on the horizon. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. Men sought him out for advice, for connections, for favors. And though he had no empire behind these walls, his presence alone carried weight. You didn't need to shout when everyone already knew your name. At night, lying on the thin mattress, Paul replayed the path that had led him here. The arrests, the bribes, the meetings, the endless balancing act between loyalty and fear. He thought of his father, the bricklayer who believed in honest work, and wondered if somewhere deep down, he'd always known his son would end up here. He thought of his mother, long gone now, who'd once lit candles for his safety. The flames had burned for years, but even prayers have limits. The outside world kept moving. Henry Hill was making more money than ever. Jimmy Burke was running the airport rackets with ruthless precision, and Tommy DeSimone was earning his reputation as both a killer and a liability. The Canari crew was still intact, still functioning, but the balance had shifted. Without Paul's quiet discipline guiding them, chaos crept in at the edges. The money kept flowing, but so did the blood. The streets didn't care about legacy. They cared about survival. Inside, Paul maintained his calm. He wrote letters to his wife, simple ones about the weather, the food, the men he met. He never mentioned business. He never mentioned the guilt of being absent while his world evolved without him. Each letter was a performance, a reminder to himself that he was still in control, even when the system said otherwise. He spent hours in the prison library, reading newspapers, studying case law, even flipping through business journals. He wanted to understand how the world was changing. It fascinated him, how legitimate men used the same tactics as criminals, just dressed in suits and contracts instead of trench coats and guns. To Paul, there was no moral difference between Wall Street and Canari, only in how the players smiled when they stole. The guards noticed his composure. One of them once asked, "Aren't you angry?" Paul looked at him, eyes calm and heavy, and said, "Anger's for men who still think they can change things." It wasn't bitterness. It was acceptance. He'd spent his life mastering control of people, of money, of emotion. Prison was just another place to practice it. Outside, his absence left a vacuum. The younger men, emboldened by his silence, started making decisions on their own. Some were smart, others reckless. Henry, flush with new connections, began taking liberties, cutting side deals, talking too openly, using too much cocaine. Jimmy started running the show his way, expanding operations, tightening his grip. The hierarchy Paul had built was shifting into something volatile, unpredictable. When word reached Paul that a few of his men had been picked up for questioning, he didn't react. He'd expected it. He'd always known that the life wasn't built to last. It was built to repeat. The same cycle, generation after generation. The smart ones adapted. The loud ones died. The quiet ones endured. 6 years is a long time when you measure it in silence. By the time Paul was released, the world outside had changed again. It was 1979. Disco had replaced doo-wop, and New York felt sharper, faster, more ruthless. The cars were flashier, the suits brighter, but underneath, the same hunger drove everything. Money, control, fear. When he walked out the gates, his family was there waiting. His wife smiled through tears, his sons hugged him, but he could see the strain in their faces. They had lived under the shadow of his name for too long. To them, he wasn't a father or a husband. He was a myth they had survived. Paul smiled gently, said all the right words, but his mind was already elsewhere. He wanted to see Brooklyn again. Driving through his old neighborhoods was like revisiting a ghost town. The faces had changed, The storefronts had new names, but the bones of the place were the same. He passed by Gefkin's bar, now under new management, and for a moment, his expression softened. Memories flooded back. The laughter, the smoke, the sound of money being counted in the backroom. The ghosts of his crew lingered in every corner. Some alive, some buried, all part of a world that no longer existed. Back home, he settled into a quieter life, or at least the illusion of one. The government had stripped him of much, but not his mind. He still had influence, connections, and most importantly, respect. Men still came to see him, asking for advice, seeking permission. Even without direct control, Paul's word carried power. He had become something like a consigliere in exile, a voice of experience in a world growing reckless. But the old ways were dying. The new generation of gangsters didn't believe in silence or patience. They believed in fast money, loud cars, and fame. They forgot that the Mafia wasn't about glamour. It was about control. Paul saw it clearly, and it saddened him. The life that had once been bound by rules and structure was becoming just another circus of greed. He had survived long enough to see his own code dissolve. The FBI hadn't forgotten him, either. Even after his release, they watched, waiting for a mistake. They knew his reputation too well to believe he'd gone straight. Every phone call, every meeting, every movement was under surveillance. Paul, of course, knew it. He played his part perfectly, keeping his distance, speaking only in generalities, smiling when they tailed him. The hunter had become the ghost again, but his health was failing. The years in prison had taken their toll. He moved slower now, coughed more, slept less. He didn't complain. Men like Paul didn't complain. They endured. In his quiet moments, he would sit near the window of his house in Queens, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The world kept spinning, but he felt himself slipping further from it. Time had become his final rival, one he couldn't outthink or outwait. When he thought about his life, he didn't dwell on the crimes or the power. What haunted him were the small moments, the faces of men who trusted him, the families left behind, the quiet dinners that turned into funerals. He didn't believe in redemption, but he believed in memory. As long as someone remembered who he truly was, the world couldn't rewrite him entirely. That was his only prayer. The tax evasion case had been his first real fall, the one that broke his rhythm and showed him his limits. It wasn't the violence or the betrayals that defined it. It was the irony. For all his precision, for all his wisdom, he'd been brought down by something as simple as numbers. But even in that, he found a strange peace. It proved what he'd always known. Power doesn't vanish with a gunshot. It fades quietly, on paper, in ink. In the years that followed, as his empire shifted beneath him and the FBI closed in tighter, Paul Vario understood one truth more deeply than ever. Silence can protect a man only so long. Eventually, even silence leaves a paper trail. And for the quiet Godfather of Canari, that trail had led him to his first real defeat. But this was only the beginning. The law had found a way to pierce his armor, and the next time they came, they wouldn't settle for paperwork. They would come for everything. And this time, the quiet man of Brooklyn would have no place left to hide. Chapter 9. Lufthansa Greenlight, 1978. The snow fell in thin white sheets over JFK Airport that December night, melting the moment it touched the asphalt. The world was asleep, but inside one of the cargo terminals, lights flickered against the frost. The air was thick with anticipation, though no one knew it yet. In just a few hours, a crew of men would pull off what would become the most infamous robbery in American history. $6 million in cash and jewels would vanish into the cold, leaving behind nothing but questions, bodies, and silence. At the top of it all, not seen, not heard, but always felt, was Paul Vario. The quiet man from Canari who'd spent his life mastering invisibility was about to become a ghost in the greatest heist the Mafia ever touched. It started with a whisper, like all great crimes do. A tip passed between drinks, a piece of information so precise it almost sounded like fate. Henry Hill had been the bridge, a conduit between worlds, connected to the right people at the right time. He'd heard from a friend who worked inside Lufthansa Airlines that a shipment of cash was arriving from West Germany. Millions of dollars meant for exchange, sitting in the vault overnight before transport. No extra guards. No alarms worth mentioning. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't just tempt men like Jimmy Burke. It haunted them. Henry brought the word to Jimmy, and Jimmy brought the idea to life. But behind every major move Burke made, there was always one constant: the shadow of Paul Vario. Paul didn't plan jobs, not anymore. He didn't steal trucks or handle guns. His work happened in whispers, in quiet nods, in phone calls that said everything without saying a word. The airport was his domain, his empire of unseen control. Every driver, every foreman, every guard, someone, somewhere, owed him a favor. If anything happened on that tarmac, it happened because Paul allowed it. When Jimmy approached him about Lufthansa, Paul didn't ask for details. He never did. He simply wanted assurance. Could it be clean? Could it be fast? Could it disappear without noise? Jimmy promised all three. He had the men, the plan, and the confidence. All Paul needed to do was give the signal, the unspoken green light that would let the job unfold under his protection. It wasn't approval in writing or even in words. Just one quiet meeting, one exchange of looks, one sentence that sealed everything. "Keep it tight," Paul said, his voice calm, eyes steady. "And keep it quiet." In the weeks before the heist, tension ran like a current through Brooklyn's underworld. Jimmy's crew prepared meticulously. Every man had a role. Every role had a risk. Tommy DeSimone was the muscle, always eager, always unpredictable. Angelo Sepe handled logistics. Louis Caffra had the van. Parnell Stacks, Edwards was supposed to handle cleanup. A simple task with catastrophic consequences waiting to happen. And Henry Hill, the middleman, the storyteller, was caught in the center of it all. Connected to everyone, trusted by few, and terrified by what could go wrong. Paul watched from a distance. He wasn't in on the details, but he felt the shift, that electric energy that comes when too many men believe they're about to touch immortality. He'd seen it before. Big scores had a way of destroying small minds. He spent his nights at Gefkin's bar, sipping scotch and listening to the faint hum of jukebox music while his thoughts wandered. He trusted Jimmy's competence, but not his calm. The Irishman had brilliance, but brilliance was dangerous when mixed with ego. Still, Paul gave his blessing. For better or worse, the die was cast. December 11th, 1978. The snow had stopped by midnight, leaving the air crisp and silent. The crew moved through the darkness like ghosts, their footsteps muffled against the frozen ground. They entered through a side gate using stolen credentials. The guards were caught off guard, bound and gagged without a shot fired. Everything went according to plan. In just under an hour, they emptied the vault, $6 million in untraceable cash and jewels. They loaded the money into vans, and then, as quietly as they had arrived, they vanished into the night. No alarms, no mistakes. It was surgical, almost beautiful in its precision. By dawn, the entire city was buzzing. The news broke fast. The biggest cash robbery in U.S. history. Television anchors called it daring. The FBI called it impossible. The underworld called it perfect. And Paul Vario, he called it dangerous. He sat in his office, the paper spread open before him, a faint frown forming as he read the headline. He didn't need to see names to know who was behind it. The problem wasn't pulling off the job. The problem was surviving it. Paul understood something the others didn't. Big money made men loud. It made them stupid. You could kill a man over $10,000, and no one would blink. But $6 million? That kind of money burned holes in the soul. It changed how people walked, how they talked, how they slept. It made them visible. And visibility was death in their world. Within days, the fallout began. The FBI descended on the airport like vultures, questioning every worker, every truck driver, every guard. They tapped phones, tailed suspects, raided warehouses. And while the streets whispered Burke's name, no one dared say Paul's. He was untouchable, invisible by design. The agents knew his reputation, but they couldn't link him directly. There was no paper trail, no phone call, no witness. He existed in the spaces between words, in the pauses where others talked too much. But inside the crew, things were unraveling fast. Jimmy's paranoia, always simmering, boiled over. He didn't trust anyone. He thought everyone was talking, everyone was plotting. The money hadn't even been fully divided yet, and already, blood was in the air. The men who'd taken part started spending. New cars, mink coats, cash flashing in bars. The kind of stupidity that made Paul's stomach turn. He'd spent decades teaching his men restraint, patience, the art of subtlety. Now, it was all dissolving in front of him. Paul called Jimmy in one night, a quiet meeting in the back of the bar. The jukebox was off, the room dim, the tension heavy. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "You need to calm your people down," he said. "They're acting like amateurs." Jimmy nodded, but his eyes darted, sharp, restless, already lost in suspicion. "I got it handled," he muttered. Paul studied him, knowing that meant the opposite. He didn't press further. He knew that Jimmy's kind of control came through fear, and fear was a currency that burned fast. The killing started soon after. Men began disappearing, drivers, handlers, anyone who knew too much or asked too many questions. The paranoia spread like fire. Henry Hill later said that you could feel the dread in the air, like the city itself was holding its breath. Everyone knew it was Jimmy cleaning house, but no one dared say it out loud. Paul kept his distance, refusing to involve himself in the chaos. But distance didn't mean safety. The FBI's net was tightening, and anyone even remotely connected to the airport was a target. For months, agents watched Paul's every move. They followed his car, listened to his phones, tried to bait his men. But Paul never slipped. He was too old, too careful. The government could see the outline of his empire, but never the man himself. Still, he knew it couldn't last. The Lufthansa heist had been too big, too loud. The silence that had protected him for decades was cracking under the weight of curiosity. He'd told Jimmy to keep it quiet, and instead, it had become the loudest crime in America. As winter turned to spring, the city began to change. The glamour of the heist faded, replaced by fear. Henry Hill was spiraling, drinking, using, unraveling. Jimmy was unraveling too, consumed by the paranoia that everyone was turning on him. Tommy, the wild card, was growing reckless, violent, unpredictable. Paul could feel the walls closing in, not from the law, but from within. His crew had become a storm he could no longer contain. One night, sitting alone in his house, Paul thought back to the first time he met Jimmy. He'd seen something powerful in him, that hunger, that brilliance, that drive to make something out of nothing. But power, Paul had learned long ago, was like fire. If you didn't control it, it consumed you. Now, watching from the sidelines, he could only see the ashes beginning to form. The FBI raids intensified. Men were dragged in, questioned for hours, released, then picked up again. The newspapers called it a siege on the mob. The public watched in fascination as agents stormed bars, junkyards, and garages. And through it all, Paul remained stoic. He said nothing, admitted nothing, trusted no one. He had survived prison, betrayal, and decades of bloodshed. He believed he could survive this too. But this was different. This wasn't about bullets anymore. This was about whispers, deals, and microphones hidden in walls. The kind of fight you couldn't win with silence alone. By the end of 1979, the Lufthansa money had vanished, hidden, stolen, or buried with the men who'd touched it. The dream was gone, replaced by fear. The FBI was still chasing ghosts, but one of those ghosts, Henry Hill, was about to break the code that had kept Paul safe his entire life. The young man Paul had once treated like family was now desperate, addicted, and terrified. When Henry finally flipped, the entire structure of Paul's empire began to crumble. He didn't rage when he heard the news. He didn't curse Henry's name. He simply sat in silence, letting the weight of inevitability sink in. Every empire, no matter how carefully built, eventually falls. And sometimes, it's not the enemy who destroys it. It's the people you raised, the ones who thought they could live forever in the shadow of your calm. The Lufthansa heist had been Paul's triumph and his tragedy. It was proof of everything he'd built: power, influence, control, and the seed of everything that would destroy it. The job had been flawless. The aftermath had been chaos. And in the end, it wasn't the FBI that finished him. It was the noise of greed, echoing through the silence he'd spent a lifetime building. In the years to come, the story would become legend. Books, movies, retellings. The names would change, the faces blurred, but the truth remained. Paul Vario was the man who made the green light possible, the quiet figure who turned a whisper into history. But legends never tell you how the story ends. They don't tell you about the man sitting alone in a cell years later, remembering the night when silence and greed collided in the cold December air. They don't tell you that the quiet Godfather of Canari didn't need to touch the money to lose everything it bought. The snow had long melted by then, but in his memory, it never stopped falling. Chapter 10. Aftermath and Bodies Fall. The winter after the Lufthansa heist was colder than anyone remembered. Snow piled high on the curbs of Brooklyn, turning gray beneath the wheels of trucks that never stopped moving. The newspapers were still buzzing about the robbery, the biggest cash theft in American history, but the excitement had turned to fear. Everyone wanted to know where the money went. The FBI wanted answers. The streets wanted silence. And in between those two worlds, somewhere in the shadows, Paul Vario waited, watching as the empire he had built began to bleed from the inside. He had seen aftermaths before. Every big score came with a price. The money was never the problem. It was what it did to people. Money changed the rhythm of men, changed their hearts, their patience, their loyalty. And the Lufthansa job wasn't just money. It was temptation turned to poison. Paul could feel the way an old man feels the weather in his bones. He didn't need to see it to know that blood was coming. Jimmy Burke had become obsessed. At first, he was calm, even proud. The job had gone perfectly. Clean, quiet, efficient. The kind of score you brag about in theory, but never actually pull off. But within weeks, his paranoia began to bloom like rot beneath the surface. He was convinced the FBI was closing in, convinced someone had talked. And when Jimmy was afraid, he got dangerous. He didn't trust easily, and after the heist, he trusted no one. Paul knew that look in Jimmy's eyes. He'd seen it before in other men, just before they burned everything they'd built. He called him in one night, asked him to sit down in the back of the bar. The lights were low, the jukebox silent. "You've got to settle things down," Paul said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You keep moving too fast. You'll make it worse." Jimmy stared at the table, his fingers tapping. "There's too many mouths," he muttered. "Too many people who know too much." Paul exhaled slowly. "Then you should have thought of that before you fed them." It wasn't a threat, just a truth. But Jimmy's eyes stayed hard. He wasn't listening anymore. The murder started soon after. It was like watching dominoes fall, one after another, each name disappearing from the streets and reappearing as a headline. Tommy DeSimone vanished first, lured to a meeting under false pretenses and never seen again. He'd killed the wrong man, crossed the wrong people. His body was never found, just another ghost in the snow. Next was Marty Krugman, the man who'd helped pass along the Lufthansa tip. He'd been asking too many questions about his cut. Then came Angelo Sepe, Louis Cafra, and even Pernell Stacks Edwards, who'd made the mistake of forgetting to get rid of the van used in the heist. One by one, they vanished, each body another thread cut clean. Paul watched it unfold with that same calm mask he'd always worn, but inside, something was cracking. The discipline he'd built his empire on was gone. His men, once controlled and efficient, were now panicked, erratic. The airports buzzed with investigators. The bars whispered with rumors. And for the first time in years, Paul felt the cold edge of chaos creeping into his world. He had always believed that silence protected you. But silence couldn't stop paranoia, and it couldn't stop fear. The FBI came down hard. They raided homes, tapped phones, followed cars. They showed up at Paul's door too, knocking politely, but meaning every sound like a threat. He opened the door, calm as ever, inviting them in with a faint smile. They asked about Burke, about Hill, about the heist. Paul said nothing. He'd been through interrogations before. He knew that the trick wasn't to outsmart them. It was to outlast them. Time was his greatest weapon, and he wielded it like a blade. But time was also catching up to him. He was older now, slower, carrying the weight of decades on his back. The faces around him were changing, growing younger, louder, less disciplined. The new generation of gangsters didn't care about the old rules. They didn't care about silence or subtlety. They wanted to be seen, to be feared. And Paul, watching them, realized the world he'd mastered was dying right in front of him. Henry Hill was unraveling. He drank more, used more, talked more. The man Paul had once trusted to hold things together was now cracking under the pressure. The FBI had been circling him for months, watching his every move, waiting for him to slip. Paul saw it coming but couldn't stop it. Henry had always been too ambitious for his own good, too addicted to the rush of power. When the agents finally got to him, offering freedom in exchange for loyalty, it wasn't a fair fight. Henry's loyalty had always been to survival. When word came that Henry had flipped, it hit Paul like a quiet knife to the ribs. He didn't rage or curse. He just sat in his office at the junkyard, staring out the heaps of twisted metal. The sound of machinery filled the air, but all he could hear was the echo of betrayal. He had built his empire on trust, on the idea that silence was sacred. But Henry had broken that code, and once a code is broken, it's never repaired. Jimmy knew it too. When Henry disappeared into witness protection, Jimmy's paranoia exploded into fury. He started pacing the bar like a caged animal, muttering about rats and revenge. Paul didn't stop him. There was nothing to stop anymore. The game had changed, and they were just pieces being moved toward the inevitable end. The trials began soon after. The FBI's case was airtight, built on Henry's testimony and years of quiet observation. They didn't need photos or recordings. They had words, spoken words from a man who'd lived it all. Each statement was a bullet aimed at the heart of Paul's world. The prosecution called it racketeering, extortion, corruption. The newspapers called it the fall of the Lucchese Empire. Paul called it inevitability. He sat through the hearings like a man listening to his own eulogy. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. His lawyer whispered strategies, objections, but Paul didn't care. He'd known from the start that this was how it would end. You don't get to live in the shadows forever without the light finding you eventually. When a verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, Paul didn't move. He just leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, a small sigh escaping his lips. Back in his cell, the nights were long. The sound of metal doors clanging shut carried through the halls like distant thunder. He thought about the men he'd known, the ones still alive and the ones who weren't. Jimmy was locked up too, serving his time with the same defiance that had once made him unstoppable. Henry was out there somewhere, living under a new name, telling stories that turned their lives into legend. And Paul was just another forgotten king in a dying empire. He would never admit it, but part of him understood Henry. The kid had been built for survival. Paul had taught him the code, but he'd also taught him fear. And fear always wins in the end. He'd built his kingdom on silence, but in the end, it was words that destroyed him. It was poetic in a way. All his life, Paul had avoided noise, avoided attention. He believed that the only way to stay alive was to disappear. But the quieter he became, the louder the world seemed to grow around him, until even his silence couldn't drown it out. The years bled together in prison. Paul became a ghost among men, respected, feared, but forgotten. His hair went white, his body weakened, but his eyes never lost that stillness. He kept to himself, reading newspapers, writing letters no one would ever see. Sometimes he'd think about the old days, the bars, the back rooms, the smell of smoke and whiskey. He'd think about the nights when Brooklyn felt alive with possibility, when loyalty still meant something. And then he'd think about the snow that fell over the airport that December morning and wonder if maybe that was the moment it had all started to end. Outside the walls, the Mafia was changing. The old guard was dying, replaced by men without patience or principle. The FBI had turned the tide. They no longer fought with guns. They fought with informants and indictments. The families were crumbling, one after another, their secrets dragged into the light. The glory days of Paul's youth, when a handshake could change a man's fortune, were gone. The silence that once protected them was now just emptiness. Sometimes, at night, Paul dreamed of Brooklyn the way it used to be. The streetlights glowing in the fog, the soft murmur of deals being made, the hum of engines at the junkyard. He dreamed of his crew, Jimmy laughing over a drink, Henry leaning in to tell another story, Tommy grinning like he knew something no one else did. In those dreams, they were all still alive, untouched, eternal. But when he woke, the only sound was the echo of doors slamming shut somewhere far down the hall. He never complained about prison. To Paul, it was just another kind of silence. He'd lived his whole life in quiet rooms, making decisions that echoed through decades. The walls didn't change that. The bars didn't take away his calm. What hurt him wasn't the confinement. It was knowing that the life he'd built was gone, and no one would ever build another like it. The rules he'd lived by, patience, loyalty, discretion, had vanished with his generation. The world outside was louder now, faster, meaner. When Paul's health began to fail, he accepted it without fuss. Cancer, the doctors said, the kind of slow death that gives you time to think about everything you've done. He didn't fight it. He didn't curse fate. He'd always believed that every man has a number, and his had been generous. He'd lived long enough to see his rise and his fall, long enough to know the cost of both. In his final months, confined to a hospital ward in Texas, he spoke little. The nurses said he was polite, quiet, almost gentle. They had no idea who he was. To them, he was just an old man with tired eyes. And maybe that was how he wanted it. For the first time in his life, he was truly invisible. He died in May of 1988, far from Brooklyn, far from the empire he'd built and lost. There were no headlines, no crowds, no grand send-off. Just a quiet burial under gray skies, another name carved into the stone. The world moved on. The streets forgot him. But the silence he left behind still lingers, faint but unbroken, like an echo beneath the hum of the city he once ruled. For Paul Vario, the aftermath wasn't about money or power. It was about inevitability. Every empire ends. Every code breaks. Every silence eventually gives way to noise. And as the bodies fell and the world turned, the quiet Godfather of Canari disappeared into the shadows one last time, leaving behind nothing but stories in the cold, unspoken truth that in the end, even silence can't save you forever. Chapter 11. Pressure mounts. Late 70s to early 80s. The air in Brooklyn had changed. The streets that once hummed with quiet confidence now vibrated with tension. The bars weren't as loud, the laughter not as real. Men spoke softer, glancing over their shoulders even when no one was there. Something had shifted, the kind of shift only those deep in the life could feel. It wasn't just fear, it was pressure, the kind that builds slow, unseen, until one day everything cracks. For Paul Vario, that crack was coming. He could hear it in the silence, the same way an old man hears thunder long before the storm. After Lufthansa, the FBI was relentless. The Bureau's agents, tired of chasing shadows, had learned the mob's rhythm. They'd stopped looking for the gun and started following the money. They didn't need shootouts or confessions anymore. They needed receipts, conversations, mistakes. And the men around Paul, the ones who had once been disciplined and quiet, were now sloppy, paranoid, loud. His empire, built on control and patience, was starting to show fractures. Every week, another subpoena. Every month, another name whispered. Paul wasn't surprised. He'd seen the pattern too many times before. Men get rich, they get comfortable. They get comfortable, they start talking. Talking leads to listening. Listening leads to prison. It was a cycle as old as the life itself. He'd outlasted most by mastering the art of silence. Not just his own, but everyone around him. But now, the people who'd once kept their mouths shut were running scared. The Lufthansa job had made them legends, but legends were dangerous things. They drew eyes, and the more eyes that looked, the harder it was to hide. The FBI's focus wasn't just on Jimmy Burke's crew. It was on the entire infrastructure that made the airport rackets possible. The trucking companies, the union representatives, the dispatchers, the handlers, all roads led back to Canari. And Canari led to Paul. His name had always stayed in the background, whispered in passing, never written down. But now, it was appearing in reports, case files, and court orders. To the agents building the case, he was the phantom behind it all, the invisible architect of a criminal network they could finally start to map. He'd been through raids before, but this was different. This was coordinated. One morning, he stepped out of his house to find unmarked cars parked at the corners of his block. He didn't need to ask who they were. The same cars followed him to the junkyard, to Gefkin's bar, even to church on Sundays. The message was clear: we see you. Paul never flinched. He'd built his power on never showing fear. But the quiet weighed heavier now. He knew they weren't just watching. They were waiting. Inside his circle, paranoia spread like wildfire. Jimmy was losing control, and Henry Hill was falling apart. Drugs, gambling, and late-night paranoia had turned him into a liability. The once slick talker now rambled to anyone who would listen, his eyes darting, his nerves shot. Paul had always despised drugs, not for moral reasons, but for practical ones. Drugs made men stupid, and stupid men got people killed. He'd warned Henry countless times to stay out of that world, but Henry never listened. Every dollar he made from it was another step toward disaster. One evening, Paul called Henry in. The bar was empty except for them. The smell of stale smoke lingered in the air. Paul didn't yell. He never needed to. His voice carried weight, even when it was soft. "You're moving too fast," he said. "You're making noise where there should be silence." Henry tried to explain, said it was just small-time stuff, said he had it under control. Paul just looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You ever notice how the loudest man in the room is always the first to fall? Henry said nothing. The silence was heavier than the words that came before it. By 1980, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The FBI's investigations were no longer just whispers. They were raids, subpoenas, indictments. The government had a new weapon, the RICO Act. For the first time, they could go after entire organizations, not just individuals. They didn't need to prove a single crime. They could connect patterns, show association, and call a conspiracy. It was brilliant, and it was deadly. The mob's greatest strength, its structure, had become its greatest weakness. Paul understood this better than anyone. He could feel the law changing beneath his feet. The days of paying off cops and politicians were fading. The Bureau wasn't playing the old game anymore. They weren't corruptible in the way the old detectives had been. These new agents were educated, patient, and determined. They didn't care about headlines. They cared about conviction rates. And they had one goal: to turn every secret Paul had ever buried into evidence. In the midst of it all, Jimmy Burke began to lose his grip entirely. The FBI's attention was like a spotlight, and Jimmy hated the light. He started seeing betrayal everywhere, in friends, family, even in shadows. Henry's paranoia fed his own. They stopped trusting each other, stopped communicating. The quiet coordination that had made their partnership powerful was gone, replaced by chaos and fear. Paul tried to steady the ship, but it was like trying to calm a storm with words. The younger men no longer listened. They'd grown up on stories of invincibility, the myth that they were untouchable. And now, watching federal agents kick in doors, seize records, and drag people away in handcuffs, that myth was collapsing. They'd never learned how to survive the slow kind of war, the kind fought with paper and patience. The first time the FBI showed up at the junkyard, Paul was sitting at his desk, sipping coffee. He didn't look up when the door opened. The agents moved through like they owned the place, snapping photos, bagging documents, marking boxes. One of them tried to make small talk, maybe hoping to provoke him. Paul didn't answer. He sat perfectly still, his eyes following every movement, his face blank. When they left, the office was turned upside down, but Paul simply picked up his coffee again. The calm wasn't an act. It was instinct. He knew that panic only made you bleed faster. But even Paul couldn't control what was happening outside those walls. The arrests came in waves. One by one, his men were picked up. Some kept their mouths shut. Others didn't. The pressure was too much. The threat of RICO meant decades in prison instead of a few years. And for the first time, loyalty started to crumble under the weight of self-preservation. The old code was breaking. The silence he'd built his life on was no longer sacred. It was negotiable. Henry Hill's arrest for drug trafficking was the final blow. When Paul heard the news, he didn't get angry. He just felt tired. The same kid he'd once trusted, the same man who'd laughed at his table and called him family, was about to undo everything. Henry's drug business had brought too much attention, too much noise. Paul knew it was only a matter of time before the kid flipped. And when he did, he'd take everyone down with him. The day Henry turned informant, Paul didn't need to hear it from the FBI. He felt it. The betrayal was quiet, but it echoed through the city like a gunshot. He'd built a life around one rule: silence keeps you safe. But now, silence had become extinct. Everyone was talking. The newspapers were calling it the death of the Mafia's golden age. For Paul, it was something more personal. It was the death of everything he believed in. The trials that followed were a spectacle. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and prosecutors painted him as a criminal mastermind. Paul sat there in his suit, calm as ever, his expression giving nothing away. He'd been in front of judges before, but this was different. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about legacy. The government wanted to make an example out of him, to show that even the quiet ones could fall. They threw every charge they could: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy. The evidence wasn't always solid, but the story was. The image of Paul as the silent, calculating Godfather was too powerful to resist. The juries believed it. The public loved it. He was sentenced again, this time for racketeering, then again for extortion. The sentences stacked until freedom became an idea, not a reality. In his final years of freedom, before prison swallowed him for good, Paul moved like a man half-ghost. The once vibrant bars were quieter now. Many of the old faces were gone, replaced by younger men who didn't understand what he'd built. They respected him out of fear, but they didn't know him. They didn't understand the weight he carried. To them, he was a relic, a legend from a fading world. He'd sit in Gefkin's sometimes, the same corner booth where he and Jimmy had once planned their empire. The jukebox still worked, but the songs had changed. The laughter was gone. The men around him talked too fast, drank too much, trusted too little. He'd sip his drink, watching them with quiet detachment. He'd outlived too many of them already, but he knew he wouldn't outlive this storm. When the final warrant came, he didn't resist. He stood up, put on his coat, and walked out like a man heading to a meeting. The agents didn't need to drag him. He went willingly, calmly, his eyes clear. He knew what waited for him: prison, sickness, maybe death. But fear wasn't in him anymore. The only thing left was acceptance. In the years that followed, as the 80s turned to dust, the Mafia world Paul had known ceased to exist. The Lucchese family fractured. The code of silence was gone, replaced by deals and plea bargains. The FBI had won, not with guns, but with patience. They had turned the mob's greatest strength, loyalty, into its greatest vulnerability. And for Paul, the man who had built his life on quiet power, it was the ultimate irony. He'd spent decades mastering the art of being invisible. Now, in the twilight of his life, invisibility came naturally. The papers stopped printing his name. The streets stopped speaking it. The world moved on without him. But deep down, in the corners of Brooklyn where the old stories still lingered, people remembered. They remembered the man who ran an empire without raising his voice. The man who turned silence into strategy, fear into control. And as the pressure that had mounted for years finally crushed him, Paul Vario faded into the past. Not with a bang, not with a confession, but with the same quiet dignity that had defined his life. A ghost of an era that no longer existed, watching as the world he built crumbled under the weight of noise, greed, and time. Chapter 12. Hill Flips. The night Henry Hill decided to talk, the world Paul Vario had built began to die. It didn't happen with a bang or a betrayal in some smoky backroom. It happened quietly, in a windowless federal interrogation room, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying flies. Henry sat there, pale, sweating, his hands trembling around a cup of cold coffee. Across from him, two FBI agents leaned forward with the patience of men who already knew they'd won. It was just a matter of time now, a matter of which thread Henry would pull first. And somewhere in Brooklyn, Paul Vario slept, unaware that by the time the sun rose, the foundation of his empire would start to crumble into dust. The choice to flip isn't a single moment. It's a slow erosion of fear and pride. For years, Henry had lived like a prince. Money, respect, women, power. He'd flown too close to the sun, and now his wings were melting. The drug deals that Paul had warned him against had drawn too much attention. The wiretaps, the surveillance, the raids, it was all tightening around him. When the FBI finally kicked down his door, he knew it was over. The only question left was how to survive it. And survival, Henry realized, was the one thing he'd always been good at. The agents played their parts perfectly. They didn't threaten him. They didn't need to. They just let the silence linger, let the fear do the talking. They spoke softly, reminding him of the stakes, his wife, his kids, his freedom. They painted pictures of what life would look like if he didn't cooperate. Decades in prison, forgotten by everyone, maybe even dead before he got there. Henry's mind drifted to Jimmy Burke's face, to that familiar smile that hid violence just beneath the surface. He knew what Jimmy did to people he suspected of talking. And if Jimmy didn't get to him, Paul might. There was nowhere left to hide. By the time Henry opened his mouth, it was already too late to stop. The first words were small, details, dates, names. Then the dam broke. Everything came pouring out. Decades of secrets, whispered loyalties, coded language, all laid bare. He told them about the airport rackets, the hijackings, the bribes, the stolen trucks, the envelopes of cash that passed through bars like communion. He told them about Jimmy's paranoia after Lufthansa, about the bodies buried in the snow. And then, finally, he told them about Paul. He didn't say it with malice. He said it with exhaustion. To Henry, Paul wasn't a monster. He was an inevitability. The man who'd made him, taught him, disciplined him. The man he'd admired and feared in equal measure. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The code that had bound them together for decades had snapped. Henry wasn't thinking about honor or betrayal anymore. He was thinking about breathing. When the Bureau realized what they had, they moved fast. They'd been circling Paul for years, gathering evidence, chasing whispers. But now they had something better, a voice from the inside. Henry's words were the missing piece. They connected dots that no investigator ever could. Suddenly, the quiet, careful capo from Canari wasn't invisible anymore. He had shape. He had weight. He had a story, one that could be told in court. When Paul heard that Henry had flipped, the room went still. It was one of those moments where time itself seemed to stop. The men sitting with him didn't say anything. They just watched his face, waiting for a reaction. But Paul didn't give them one. He just sat there, eyes fixed ahead, breathing slow and even. Then, finally, he said softly, "I knew he would." It wasn't anger, or even disappointment. It was inevitability. He'd spent a lifetime teaching men like Henry the art of survival, and now, Henry had used that lesson against him. The news spread through Brooklyn like fire. In bars, in diners, in the back rooms of social clubs, men whispered Henry's name like a curse. A rat, a traitor, a ghost who traded the code for safety. But beneath the outrage was fear. If Henry could talk, anyone could. And if the government could make him disappear into witness protection, then the old rules didn't mean anything anymore. The world that Paul had built, a world where silence was sacred, had just been rewritten. The indictments came quickly. Paul was charged again, racketeering, extortion, conspiracy. But this time, the evidence wasn't just paperwork and speculation. It was testimony. It was voices. Henry Hill, once the golden boy, now stood in court, pointing across the room, his words sharp and deliberate. Every sentence was a nail in the coffin. He spoke about the airport rackets, about the payments, about how Paul had arranged jobs and taken cuts. He even described the day Paul gave the nod for the Lufthansa heist, how his approval had been quiet but absolute. The jury hung on every word. Paul sat there unmoving. His face was blank, his eyes steady, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled, just slightly, resting on the table. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, the quiet realization that his own creation had turned against him. The silence he'd worshipped had finally been broken, not by violence, not by the law, but by the voice of a man he'd once called family. The prosecutors painted him as the mastermind behind decades of crime, the spider at the center of the web. They spoke about his influence over the unions, his control of the trucking companies, his power at JFK Airport. They described him as untouchable, the man no one dared cross. And for years that was true. But now, as Henry's words echoed through the courtroom, Paul understood what it meant to be touched, not by bullets or betrayal, but by inevitability. When a verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, Paul didn't look surprised. He stood slowly as the judge read the sentence, his posture still perfect, his voice calm when he spoke. "You do what you have to do," he said. It wasn't defiance. It was acceptance. The code he'd lived by was gone. The world had changed, and he'd stayed still too long to survive it. Prison was nothing new to Paul, but this time it felt different. The world outside had shifted in ways he could barely recognize. The mob was splintering, the families turning on each other, the FBI dismantling everything piece by piece. The names that once ruled New York, Lucchese, Gambino, Genovese, were now headlines and statistics. The silence had died, replaced by microphones and plea deals. And the young men who filled the streets no longer spoke in whispers. They bragged, they flaunted, they posted. The art of invisibility had died with Paul's generation. In his cell, he kept to himself. He read newspapers, though he rarely smiled at the stories anymore. Every few weeks, a new name appeared, another boss arrested, another associate flipped. He'd outlasted most of them, but didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching a slow funeral for the life he'd once ruled. He'd built his empire on patience, on the belief that time and silence could protect you. But time, it seemed, had turned against him. Henry Hill went on to become a celebrity of sorts. Books, interviews, movie deals. The world wanted to hear his version of the story, the glamorous side of the life, the money, the danger, the loyalty, and the betrayal. Paul's name became part of that mythology, reimagined and dramatized. The world came to know him not as the quiet, calculating man he truly was, but as Paul Cicero, the cinematic version, the legend stripped of humanity. Paul never saw the film, but he heard about it. Agar mentioned it one day, grinning as he said, "They made a movie about you." Paul just nodded. "They make movies about ghosts," he said, "not men." The betrayal never left him, not because of what it cost him, his freedom, his power, his name, but because of what it revealed. That loyalty, no matter how deep, had limits. That fear, no matter how strong, could be broken. He believed in silence as a shield, but in the end, it had become a coffin. Every secret he'd kept, every careful decision, every unspoken rule, all of it had been spoken aloud by a man who once looked at him with admiration. The world outside kept moving, but Paul's world stopped the day Henry opened his mouth. Everything after that was just aftermath, the slow decay of a man out of time. He'd seen it happen to others, but now it was his turn to fade. The empire he'd built was gone, replaced by headlines and legends. The quiet was still there, but it wasn't peace anymore. It was emptiness. On the rare days when he allowed himself to think about the past, he didn't dwell on the crimes or the money. He thought about the men, the laughter in the bar, the sound of dice rolling on a table, the clink of glasses. He thought about the smell of coffee in the mornings, the sound of trains in the distance, the simple things that made the noise of life worth living. And he thought about the moment when it all went wrong, when a man he'd trusted chose words over silence. As his health declined, the visits grew fewer. His wife came when she could, his sons less often. They'd lived too long in the shadow of his life to truly forgive it. Sometimes a young guard would ask him about the old days, about the heist, about the people he'd known. Paul would just shake his head. "They're all gone," he'd say quietly. "All of them." In the end, that was the truth. They were gone. The world had forgotten their names, except in stories told for entertainment. The life they'd lived, the codes, the silence, the loyalty, had become nothing more than nostalgia. And for Paul Vario, sitting alone in a cold cell, that was the final betrayal. Not that Henry had talked, but that the world had stopped listening. When he finally closed his eyes for the last time in 1988, there were no headlines, no fanfare, just a brief notice, a quiet burial, and the fading echo of a life lived in the shadows. Henry's story would outlive his, told and retold by people who'd never known him. But those who had, the few still breathing, scattered and forgotten, knew the truth. Paul Vario wasn't a villain or a saint. He was the silence between every story, the stillness beneath the noise. And in the end, it wasn't bullets or the law that killed him. It was the one thing he'd spent his whole life trying to control, a man's voice. Henry Hill had broken the silence, and once broken, silence never returns. The prosecutors described his empire like an organism. Vario controlled the flow of goods through JFK. One of them said, "Nothing moved without his say-so." They spoke about his bar in Canari, his junkyard office, his meetings with Jimmy Burke. They made it sound almost poetic, the quiet man pulling strings behind the noise of New York City. The defense tried to fight back, painting Paul as an old man with fading influence, someone the FBI had built into a myth because they couldn't catch the real killers. But it didn't matter. The story was too good, too clean, too cinematic. The jury wasn't just convicting a man, they were convicting an idea. Inside the courtroom, Paul seemed detached. He'd sit perfectly still for hours, his face expressionless, his hands folded. The younger men sitting behind him, lawyers, family, old friends, watched in awe. Even under fire, even as witness after witness named him, he didn't break. He didn't shake his head or whisper to his attorneys. He didn't look back when Henry Hill was mentioned again. The prosecutors couldn't rattle him because there was nothing left to rattle. He had already accepted his fate long before he walked into that courtroom. When the sentence came, another decade, stacked on top of the 6 years he was already serving, Paul nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already known. The judge's voice droned on about justice, about deterrence, about the need to send a message. Paul didn't need the message. He'd been living with it for decades. He knew what this was. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about closing a chapter in American crime. The courtroom wasn't just his reckoning. It was a requiem for an era. After the trial, as marshals let him out, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Paul kept his head down. He didn't give them what they wanted. No quotes, no outbursts, no emotion. Just that same measured walk, that same heavy silence. The last image the cameras caught was of his hand raised slightly, as if brushing something invisible from the air. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was his way of saying goodbye to the noise. Prison this time was harder. He was older, weaker, his health failing. The concrete floors and metal bars that had once felt like temporary inconveniences now felt permanent, final. His cell was small, his days long. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The younger inmates whispered his name with a mix of respect and curiosity. Some of them didn't even know who he really was. They just knew the legend. The man from Goodfellas. The ghost from Canari. The boss who never raised his voice. Occasionally, guards would ask him about the Lufthansa heist, or about Jimmy Burke, or about Henry Hill. Paul would just shake his head. Stories, he'd say quietly. That's all they are now. He wasn't interested in reliving it. The past was heavy, and he'd carried it long enough. The years between his sentencing and his death blurred together. The outside world kept moving, forgetting him little by little. The Lucchese family had changed leadership. The streets had changed faces. The bars and businesses that once whispered his name were now gone or under new management. Even the airport rackets had shifted to new hands. The world no longer needed men like Paul Vario. It needed men who could talk, who could deal, who could betray. Silence had gone out of style. In 1987, Paul's health began to collapse. Cancer, the doctors said. His lungs were failing, his body shrinking under the weight of years. He was moved to a federal medical facility in Fort Worth, Texas, far from Brooklyn, far from the life he'd once ruled. The nurses there didn't know his history. To them, he was just another old man in a gray jumpsuit who kept to himself and said thank you when they brought his meals. They had no idea that the quiet man they wheeled through the halls had once held the power to change lives with a word. He spent his final months reading the paper, though he rarely finished an article. Sometimes he'd stare out the window at the Texas sky, wide and empty, and think about the streets of Brooklyn, the sound of cars on Flatlands Avenue, the smell of rain on pavement, the laughter from Gefkin's bar. He thought about the men he'd lost, Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, Tommy DeSimone, all the ghosts that had walked beside him through the years. He didn't hate them. He didn't even pity them. They were part of the story, just like he was. And all stories in the same way. On May 3rd, 1988, Paul Vario took his last breath. There were no last words, no final declarations. Just silence. The kind of silence that had always defined him. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, among other men of the life. Names that once meant power, now just letters carved in stone. The papers barely covered it. A few lines here and there, a brief mention of an old mobster passing away quietly in prison. The world had already moved on. The Mafia, as it had once been, was over. The trials, the betrayals, the RICO laws, they had turned the underworld into memory. The last generation of real gangsters was fading, and Paul Vario, the forgotten Goodfellas Godfather, was among the last to go. In the end, his courtroom reckonings weren't just about guilt or innocence. They were about the end of an idea, the belief that silence could outlast time, that control could outsmart chaos. The law had evolved, and the men like Paul, who thrive in the gray spaces between power and secrecy, had become relics. But if you walk through Brooklyn late at night, when the air is still and the city hums low, you can almost feel it. The ghost of that quiet authority, the echo of a time when men like Paul Vario ruled with whispers instead of words. And maybe that's the true legacy he left behind. Not the crimes, not the money, but the memory of what it meant to hold power in absolute silence. Because in the end, even when the law took everything from him, the one thing it could never take was that silence. It belonged to him, from the first day he walked the streets of Brooklyn to the last breath he took in a Texas prison. The silence was his empire, and in that silence, Paul Vario will always live. Chapter 13, Courtroom Reckonings, 1984 to 1985. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones and lingers long after you've left. The marble floors echoed with the shuffle of feet, the murmur of lawyers, the creak of wooden benches worn down by years of men waiting for judgment. It was 1984, and the quiet Godfather of Canari sat in a chair at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable. Paul Vario looked like any other aging businessman in a dark suit. You wouldn't know, looking at him, that this was the man who had once controlled a small empire within the Lucchese family, who had turned the JFK Airport into his personal gold mine, who had survived decades of violence and corruption by mastering the art of silence. But here, under the fluorescent lights of federal justice, silence wasn't power anymore. It was evidence. The prosecutors had spent years preparing for this. They had studied Paul's life like archaeologists brushing dust off a ruin. Every old deal, every old favor, every man who'd ever owed him something, they'd dug it up. The mountain of paper in front of them wasn't just evidence. It was a map of his entire world. But the crown jewel of their case wasn't the documents. It was the voices. Henry Hill's testimony had cracked open the door, and the government wasn't going to let it close. They were building the final chapter of their story, the one where Paul Vario, the ghost of Brooklyn, finally became visible. The first trial was for fraud, a smaller charge, at least compared to everything else hanging over him. It was about Henry Hill's parole release years earlier, about how Paul had lied to the parole board, claiming that Henry had a legitimate job at his restaurant when he was, in fact, still knee-deep in criminal work. It seemed trivial in the grand scheme of things, almost petty. But for the prosecutors, it was symbolic. It wasn't about the job. It was about the lie. They wanted to show that even when Paul wasn't stealing or killing, he was bending the rules to protect his empire. It was the first crack in the image of the disciplined, untouchable man he'd spent his life building. Henry took the stand, nervous but composed. He wore a suit too big for him, his voice unsteady but clear. When he spoke Paul's name, the courtroom fell quiet. He described the day Paul vouched for him, how the old man had sat before the board, calm as ever, lying through his teeth to secure his release. To Henry, it had been loyalty, one last act of protection from the man who'd raised him in the life. But to the government, it was obstruction, deception, another example of how deep the mob's influence ran. Paul sat there listening, his eyes never leaving Henry. He didn't glare or shift in his seat. He just watched. Maybe he was remembering the kid who used to sit in his bar, cracking jokes, running errands, dreaming of being somebody. Or maybe he was just wondering how many more words Henry had left to use against him. When the guilty verdict came, Paul didn't flinch. He'd expected it. 6 years. It wasn't the end. Not yet. But it was the beginning of the end. The agents didn't even try to hide their satisfaction. To them, this was justice catching up. To Paul, it was just another transaction, another debt to be paid. The Lucchese family had always taught its men that time was the ultimate currency. You spent it in prison, or you spent it dead. Either way you paid. But the real reckoning came soon after. In 1985, the government launched a broader case: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, the whole web. They wanted to dismantle what was left of Paul's power, to cut off every lingering influence he still had in Brooklyn and beyond. This time, it wasn't just about one man. It was about the system he represented. They wanted to prove that even the quietest, most careful of mob bosses couldn't outlast the law forever. The case focused on labor racketeering, the corruption at JFK Airport that had made Paul's fortune. The unions, the trucking companies, the kickbacks, the threats, it all came spilling out. The government's witnesses, one after another, painted a picture of a world run by fear and quiet manipulation. They spoke of men who disappeared, of businesses forced to pay just to operate, of workers too scared to speak. And at the center of it all, they said, was Paul Vario, the man who never raised his voice, who never left fingerprints, who ruled through a glance and a nod. Chapter 14, Final Years and Death in Custody, 1985 to 1988. The final years of Paul Vario's life passed in slow motion, like a man watching the tide recede and knowing it will never come back. The courtroom lights, the cameras, the headlines, those had all faded. What was left was silence. The same silence that had once protected him now felt heavier, almost cruel. He had built his empire through patience and stillness. But in the end, stillness was all he had left. Prison walls don't echo with power. They echo with the footsteps of men who used to matter. By 1985, the world outside had changed beyond recognition. The old Mafia codes were collapsing, crumbling under the weight of betrayal and modernization. The FBI was everywhere, armed not with guns, but with information, wiretaps, informants, recorded deals. The new generation of gangsters no longer looked like the men Paul had raised. They didn't wear suits or keep quiet in bars. They bragged. They wanted to be seen. And as they posted their reputations on the streets, the life Paul once believed eternal was disintegrating right before his eyes. Inside prison, the routines were simple, mechanical. The clang of the morning count, the shuffle to the mess hall, the hours of stillness broken only by the sound of keys. Paul was 70 now, though he carried himself with the same slow, deliberate calm that had always defined him. His eyes had dulled, but not with fear, only with acceptance. Every day looked like the last. Every sunrise was the same shade of gray. He read newspapers when he could get them, but most of the names inside didn't mean anything anymore. The city he had once ruled was a stranger to him now. Sometimes, guards would whisper about him. They'd pass his cell, glance in, and say things like, "That's Vario, the guy from Goodfellas." They said it like he was a ghost that somehow hadn't realized he was dead yet. Paul didn't respond. He didn't recognize the word Goodfellas. He didn't know that his name had already been turned into legend, that Hollywood was preparing to rewrite his story. He'd lived a life avoiding attention, and now his likeness was about to become immortal. But he wouldn't live long enough to see it. What he did see, though, was the slow unraveling of the world he'd helped shape. The Lucchese family was no longer what it once was. The bosses were gone, dead, imprisoned, or flipped. The old rackets were drying up, the money thinner, the risks higher. Every man Paul had trusted was either behind bars or buried. Jimmy Burke was locked away. Henry Hill was in witness protection, and the names that had once carried weight now floated like ghosts in the FBI's archives. Paul wasn't angry about it. He'd never been the type to curse the future. But he felt it, the emptiness that comes when everything you built stops meaning something. He spent most days in silence, speaking only when necessary. The other inmates treated him with quiet reverence. They'd nod respectfully when he passed in the yard, keeping their distance. They knew who he was, or at least who he had been. To them, he was one of the last real mobsters, one of the men who had lived by a code, who hadn't sold out for fame or money. There was something almost regal about him. Even stripped of everything, Paul carried an aura that couldn't be taken away. It wasn't about wealth or reputation anymore. It was about how he held himself, calm, deliberate, unbroken. At night, when the cell block went quiet, he'd lie on his bunk and stare at the ceiling, letting the memories play. The smell of whiskey in Gefkin's bar, the sound of dice rolling across a table, the laughter of his men, the murmur of conversations that weren't meant to be heard. He thought about the first time he'd shaken Jimmy Burke's hand, the first time Henry Hill had walked into his life, a nervous kid with big eyes and bigger ambition. He thought about the airport, the trucks, the cash, and then he thought about how it all ended. A single voice in a courtroom, a lifetime undone by words. He never spoke Henry's name out loud again, not because of hate, but because the sound of it carried too much history. The betrayal still burned quietly inside him, but time had softened the edges. By the mid-'80s, even anger felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. What was the point of rage when the world you'd fought for no longer existed? What was the point of revenge when everyone who mattered was already gone? He'd spent his life controlling everything, his words, his image, his empire. But death, he knew, was the one thing no man could control. By 1986, his health had begun to fail. His body, once strong and deliberate, was starting to betray him. The cough came first, deep, dry, persistent. Then the weight loss, the fatigue, the pain that settled in his chest like an unpayable debt. The prison doctor told him it was lung cancer. He nodded once, saying nothing. It wasn't fear that filled him. It was understanding. He'd smoked for decades, inhaled the stress of 100 lifetimes. Death wasn't a stranger. It was just another appointment on a long list of obligations. They moved him to the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas, a sterile place that smelled of bleach and resignation. The air was dry, the halls quiet. The nurses were kind, but distant. They didn't know who he was, and he didn't tell them. To them, he was just another patient, another number. The anonymity suited him. After a lifetime of being watched, of being whispered about, the invisibility was a relief. He could sit in his wheelchair by the window, watching the light shift across the courtyard, and no one asked him for favors or money or confessions. Sometimes, the other inmates would approach him, curious about the past. They'd ask about the heist, about Burke, about the old days. Paul would give them the same answer every time. It's all stories now. It was true. The facts didn't matter anymore. The money was gone. The men were gone. The world had moved on. All that was left were the stories. And stories had a way of becoming something else entirely once the people inside them were dead. In those final years, Paul found a strange peace in routine. He'd wake early, eat little, read when he could. He rarely spoke on the phone. His wife wrote letters, soft, careful words about family, about how the seasons changed, about how the grandkids were growing. He'd read them slowly, his eyes tracing each word like a prayer. He'd write back sometimes, though his hands had grown unsteady. The letters were simple, direct. "I'm fine," he'd write. "Don't worry." It was the same phrase he'd used his whole life, and even now, it was a lie. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, when the silence pressed too hard against the walls. On those nights, he thought about the choices he'd made. Not with regret, exactly, but with clarity. He knew what his life had been. He didn't pretend it had been noble, but he understood it. Every move, every deal, every decision had been part of code that once made sense. But the code was gone now, buried beneath indictments and headlines. He'd lived by a set of rules that no longer applied to the world outside. It was like being a soldier who outlived his war. By early 1988, he could feel the end closing in. His breathing grew shallow, his voice rasped. The nurses tried to comfort him, but Paul waved them off with a small smile. "I've had worse," he'd whisper. He wasn't lying. He'd survived beatings, prison riots, betrayal, loss. What was death compared to that? It was just another door, another silence. One morning in May, he didn't wake up. The guards found him sitting in his wheelchair by the window, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he'd fallen asleep watching the sunrise. There was no struggle, no noise, just quiet. The same quiet that had followed him all his life. News of his death barely made the papers. A small paragraph in the back pages of the New York Times, a few lines on the wire services. Paul Vario, reputed organized crime figure and former Lucchese family capo, died Tuesday at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas. He was 73. That was it. No fanfare, no headlines, no crowds. The world had already forgotten him. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same resting place as many of the men he'd once called brothers. His funeral was small. A few family members, a few old faces who still remember the days when Brooklyn answered to him. The priest spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, of God's mercy. But Paul's life had never been about redemption. It had been about survival. He'd lived in the spaces between right and wrong, between power and fear. There was no moral in his story, no lesson to be learned. Just the quiet truth that power fades and silence endures. After the service, the handful of mourners lingered for a while. The air smelled of rain. A light wind brushed through the cemetery, carrying the distant hum of the city. Somewhere out there, planes from JFK still roared overhead. The same airport that had once filled his pockets and defined his life. Now, it was just background noise, a reminder that the world keeps moving even when its kings are gone. Years later, when Goodfellas hit theaters, Paul's name found its way back into the light, though not as his own. Paul Cicero, they called him, the quiet, composed boss who sliced garlic with a razor and ruled through calm authority. The movie turned his life into myth, his silence into legend. For millions, that was who Paul Vario became, the cinematic version of a man who never wanted fame. He would have hated it. He didn't believe in being remembered. He believed in disappearing. But maybe that's the irony of all. The man who spent his entire life avoiding attention became immortal through it. His story, twisted and dramatized, lived on in whispers and screens. People spoke his name again, not knowing the real man behind it. The one who sat quietly by a prison window in Texas, watching the light fade. In the end, Paul Vario died as he lived, in silence. No confessions, no apologies, no noise. Just the stillness of a man who had outlasted everyone but time itself. And though his empire fell, though his name was buried beneath fiction and legend, one truth remained untouched. power built on silence doesn't vanish. It lingers, invisible, in the spaces where words fail. And somewhere, deep in the memory of Brooklyn, where the streets still whisper the names of ghosts, you can almost hear him. A faint voice, calm and unshaken, reminding the world that the loudest men are forgotten first, and the quiet ones, if they're patient enough, never really disappear. Chapter 15. Myth, Movie, Legacy. It begins not in a courtroom, nor on the streets of Brooklyn, but on a movie screen, 30 feet tall and flickering in the dark. The audience leans forward as a soft, haunting voice says, "As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster." It's 1990, and Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas has just hit theaters. The story is Henry Hill's, the kid from the old days, the one who talked, who broke the code, who destroyed the silence. But behind every frame, behind every whispered line about the family, there's another figure, quiet, steady, composed. The man they call Paul Cicero. To most of the world, he's a character. To those who lived it, he was Paul Vario, the real man behind the myth. The forgotten Godfather whose power didn't roar, it resonated. For the first time in decades, Paul's name was back in conversation, but not in the way he would have wanted. Hollywood had turned his life into art, stripping it of its weight, polishing the edges, turning blood and loyalty into entertainment. To the filmmakers, he was an archetype, the calm, soft-spoken boss who ate quietly while others plotted. But to those who knew him, that calm wasn't just personality, it was a weapon. Silence was his armor, and restraint was his power. Scorsese captured the essence but not the soul. What the screen couldn't show was the gravity in a room when Paul Vario entered, the way men's voices dropped, the way the air seemed to still. Ray Liotta played Henry Hill with manic brilliance. Joe Pesci turned Tommy DeSimone into a firestorm of chaos. And Paul Sorvino, standing in for Paul Vario, captured something deeper, the stillness of danger. The way power can sit in silence and still command obedience. Sorvino later said in interviews that he found the character by looking inward, finding the stillness that could unsettle others without saying a word. What he didn't know was that's exactly who Paul had been. A man who could destroy you without ever raising his voice. A man whose control came not from violence, but from presence. The real Paul Vario never lived to see the movie. By the time Goodfellas premiered, he'd been dead 2 years. He never saw his life turned into legend, never saw his name rewritten into pop culture mythology. But maybe that was fitting. He'd always preferred the shadows. Fame was for the loud, the reckless, the doomed. Paul had spent a lifetime doing the opposite, staying invisible, letting others take the spotlight and the fall. And yet, in death, he became what he'd avoided his entire life: famous. The irony was cruel and perfect. The man who believed in silence became immortal because of noise. People who had never heard his name now watch his fictional version cut garlic with a razor blade, teaching a generation that real power didn't need a shout. They quoted him, admired him, even respected him. But the truth of the man was much darker and far quieter. In real life, Paul didn't hold court in prison kitchens. He didn't share meals and fatherly advice with the soldiers. He was colder, sharper, more distant. He was the kind of man who studied people the way chess players study the board. 3 moves ahead, always calculating. His affection, when it showed, came in strange ways: a nod, a favor, a silence that meant approval. But when he withdrew that silence, when he stopped looking your way, it was a death sentence long before anyone pulled a trigger. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he just made you disappear. Still, for all its embellishment, Goodfellas did something powerful. It made the underworld human again. It peeled back the myth of the mob as an empire of honor and revealed it for what it truly was: a machine of greed, fear, and fleeting loyalty. And yet, it couldn't resist mythologizing men like Paul. The world loves stories about order and chaos, about kings who rule from the dark. And that's what Paul became in the public eye: a symbol of the old way, the dying art of quiet power. But in Brooklyn, Among those who remembered him, the myth was never enough. They remembered the man before the headlines, before the heists, before the trials. They remembered the young, tough kid on the corner in Brownsville, the one who kept his head down while everyone else tried to prove themselves. They remembered how he built his empire piece by piece, not through noise or brutality, but through discipline. They remembered that even as the world fell apart around him, Paul never changed his tone, never lost his composure. To them, he wasn't a movie character. He was a code, a way of living that no longer existed. There's something tragic about that kind of legacy. The real man fades, and the story remains. People remember the version that entertains them, not the one that warns them. The truth about Paul Vario isn't that he was untouchable. It's that he was human, bound by the same flaws that destroyed everyone else. Pride, trust, habit. He believed he could control loyalty the way a conductor controls an orchestra. But loyalty isn't music. It's a storm. And when Henry Hill opened his mouth, that storm blew through everything Paul had ever built. After the movie came out, Henry Hill became a celebrity of sorts. He appeared on talk shows, told stories about the old days, laughed about the men who had once terrified the city. He spoke about Paul too, always with a mix of respect and guilt, as if he knew the weight of what he'd done. He called Paul a gentleman, a boss from another era, but there was something hollow in his words. Because no matter how many interviews Henry gave, no matter how many times he tried to explain himself, he could never undo what his voice had done. His fame was built on Paul's ruin. To the world, Goodfellas was just a movie. To those who lived it, it was a resurrection and a distortion. Jimmy Burke became Jimmy Conway. Tommy DeSimone became Tommy DeVito. Paul Vario became Paul Cicero. Each name changed, each detail adjusted, but the shadows beneath them stayed real. The truth lingered, hidden in plain sight. When audiences applauded, they weren't clapping for fiction, they were clapping for ghosts. In the years that followed, documentaries, books, and podcasts would retell the story again and again. Each one promised the real truth. Each one claimed new insights. But every retelling moved the truth a little further away. Paul became a symbol, then a reference, then a line of dialogue. Even his photograph, black and white, formal, unassuming, looked more like a relic than a man. People spoke about him as though he were a mythic figure, a phantom from a time when honor still meant something in the underworld. But honor, as Paul knew, was just another form of control. And like everything else, it fades when power does. Somewhere in Brooklyn, in the quiet corners where the past refuses to die, there are still old men who remember the real version. Men who once worked the docks, who once collected envelopes, who once saw Paul drive by in that gray Lincoln with the windows up and his eyes forward. They'll tell you he wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind either. He was fair, which, in that world, meant dangerous. If you did your job, he left you alone. If you crossed him, you never saw it coming. That was the balance he maintained. Fear and respect perfectly measured. And yet, when they speak of him now, there's something else in their tone. A quiet mourning. Not for the man, but for the world he represented. The old way. The structure. The discipline. The silence. Because after Paul, the streets changed forever. The chaos of the 80s, the greed of the 90s, the disarray of the new millennium. It all began when men like him were gone. He wasn't just the end of an era. He was its last whisper. Time has a cruel way of flattening legends. It takes complex men and reduces them to roles. The villain, the hero, the ghost. Paul never saw himself as any of those. He was, in his mind, a businessman, a pragmatist, a man who understood that power wasn't about headlines. It was about stability. He didn't want to rule the world. He just wanted control over his corner of it. The tragedy is that he achieved exactly that, and it still destroyed him. Even now, more than 3 decades after his death, his shadow lingers. Every time someone quotes Goodfellas, every time someone imitates the way Paul Sorvino's character speaks, softly, while slicing garlic paper thin, the myth breathes again. But beneath that image, the truth remains buried. The real Paul Vario wasn't a movie villain or a father figure. He was a man who lived and died by code no one could keep forever. In the end, that's what his legacy became, a cautionary tale disguised as glamour. The young men who watched Goodfellas dreaming of the life it portrayed never understood the cost. They saw the suits, the money, the camaraderie. They didn't see the paranoia, the betrayal, the endless erosion of trust. They didn't see the silence that followed, the loneliness of power. Paul's story isn't a celebration, it's a requiem, a warning sung softly, drowned out by applause. If Paul could see it now, the films, the interviews, the endless fascination, he might laugh. Not a loud laugh, just a small one, the kind that hides behind tired eyes. Because in a way, he'd won. He'd vanished in life, and now, even in death, he remained untouchable. The world had turned him into something larger than the man he was, and yet, they still didn't really know him. They never would. That was his last victory. The myth continues because silence invites imagination. People fill the quiet with their own versions of truth. And Paul Vario left behind a lot of quiet. Maybe that's what he wanted all along. Not fame, not absolution, but to be remembered on his own terms, even if those terms were rewritten. Maybe that's what power truly is. Not control over others, but control over how you disappear. In the final scene of Goodfellas, Henry Hill breaks the fourth wall, looking directly into the camera as he laments the life he's lost. "I'm an average nobody," he says. "I get to live the rest of my life like a schnook." It's a line about regret, about the futility of greed and glory. But if you listen closely, it's also about Paul. Because while Henry's words were confessions, Paul's were never spoken. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to look into the camera. His story was written in silence, and silence doesn't confess. And so it ends, not with a gunshot, not with betrayal, not with vengeance, but with the echo of a man who mastered invisibility. The forgotten Goodfellas Godfather, the quiet ruler of Brooklyn, the man who taught the world that sometimes the most dangerous voice is the one that never speaks at all. He is long gone now, buried beneath years of myth and memory. But somewhere, under the noise of legend and cinema, the real Paul Vario still lingers, a ghost in the margins, watching the world talk about him and saying nothing, just as he always did. And maybe that's how he wanted it, to have the last word by never saying a word at all.